The rope bites in under her arms, and the snow is coming down so thickly that the men paying it out from the top of the tower lose sight of her before she's halfway to the ground. The tower is St. George's, the castle is Oxford, and it has been under siege since the 26th of September, and it is now December, which is 11 weeks of watching the stores go down and the weather come in. King Stephen's men are camped in a ring all the way around the walls, close enough that the garrison can smell their cooking, which after 11 weeks is its own particular kind of warfare. There is almost nothing left inside worth eating. She's dressed in white, all of it, cloak, hood, wrappings bound over her boots, because the whole Thames Valley outside the walls is buried under snow, and white against white is the nearest thing to invisibility anybody in the year 1142 can arrange. Her feet touch the ground at the base of the tower. She does not run. Running is what gets you seen. She walks out across open ground straight through the siege lines of the man who has spent a season trying to starve her into the open, past sentries who are cold and bored and watching for something dark moving against something pale, and who therefore do not notice the pale thing moving against the pale. Then the river, the Isis, frozen hard enough to carry a walking woman. She crosses it on foot in the dark, listening to the ice, and then 6 miles. 6 miles through deep snow at night in December, on the diet of a besieged garrison to Abingdon. The next morning, Oxford Castle surrenders. There is no longer anybody inside worth besieging. Her name is Matilda. She's a king's daughter and the widow of a Holy Roman Emperor, and she keeps the title Empress for the rest of her life. Long after that emperor is dead, and she has married a French count instead, on the reasonable grounds that Empress outranks Countess, and she sees no earthly reason to trade down. She is fighting a civil war against her own cousin, for a throne she believes is hers by right, and by her father's sworn oath, and on this night she is fighting it by walking through a snowfield in a white cloak with the enemy on both sides of her. Historians still argue whether she was lowered from that tower on a rope at all, or whether she slipped out through a small gate in the wall while the watch was looking the other way, because the chroniclers who recorded it were not standing in the snow themselves, and they do not entirely agree with one another. But here is the part that ought to unsettle you, and it is not the rope. Matilda is remembered because she was an empress. That escape is famous because it happened to somebody whose name was going to be written down anyway. Strip the title off, though, and look at what she physically did. She walked for hours through deep snow in winter, in clothing that was not remotely waterproof, at the end of 11 weeks of short rations with no light, no map, and no possibility of stopping, and she arrived upright, still giving orders. We skip past that, because we assume an extraordinary woman must have had some extraordinary reserve tucked away. She didn't. She had ordinary medieval reserves. That is the genuinely alarming part. Because the women who were not empresses, the ones who never got a chronicler, who survive in the records only as the wife of, or as a name scratched into a manor court roll, or as a line in an account book noting a payment of 4p. Those women were out in the snow too, not once dramatically to escape a siege, every winter, twice a day, with a bucket. So this is not a story about one exceptional woman being tough. It is a story about where the ordinary baseline sat, and about how quickly and comprehensively you and I would fold if somebody dropped us into an average Tuesday in 1290. I say that with enormous affection. I would fold first, and I would fold loudly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and what the clock says where you are right now. I love finding a rainy Tuesday afternoon in Manila parked right next to a Monday midnight in Ohio, all of you somehow in the same room. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because you are not going to be an empress tonight. I'm sorry. No rope, no tower, no white cloak, no chronicler waiting on the far side of the ice at Abingdon. You're going to be ordinary. Deeply, thoroughly, statistically ordinary, which is to say one of the millions of women whose work is the reason anybody in this century has bread, cloth, ale, or children who survive. You will not have a surname anyone bothers to spell consistently. You will not own the ground you stand on. If you are typical, you married in your early 20s rather than your teens, because in this corner of Europe women marry later than the storybooks suggest, and something like 1 woman in 6 never marries at all. And it is dark. Properly dark. Not the orange half-dark of a city bedroom with a streetlight leaking round the curtain, but the older dark, the kind that has no edges and gives your eyes nothing at all to catch on. The room is cold, not brisk. Cold in the way that has got into the blankets and into your shoulders and into the small of your back where the wool has pulled away. Somewhere off to your left there is a low red glow under a heap of ash, and somewhere very close there is breathing that is not yours, and you are lying in the last soft minute before your body admits that it is awake. And then you are. Awake, that is, with no alarm, no glowing rectangle telling you the time and the temperature and the state of the world, just the flat certainty that the night has done what it was going to do and the day is now your problem. The first thing you become aware of, before your eyes are any use, is that you are extremely warm on one side and extremely cold on the other. This is because there are other people in the bed. There is no version of this where there are not other people in the bed. Depending on the household that is a husband, 2 or 3 children, and quite possibly a servant or a lodger or a widowed aunt, all arranged along a straw-stuffed mattress on a low frame, or a pallet on the floor under woolen coverlets that have never once been washed and never will be. It is central heating with elbows in it. In deep cold you will be actively grateful for every one of them. The mattress is straw or chaff, restuffed when it goes flat or infested, and it will do both, because a warm bed packed with organic material is a paradise for things with legs. There is a Parisian household book written around 1393 by a wealthy old husband for his 15-year-old wife. He was at least 60, 4 decades her senior, and openly training her to be a credit to whichever man she married after he died. And among the recipes in the sermons, he devotes real, sincere, hard-won attention to the problem of fleas in the bed and bedchamber. Slices of bread smeared with glue, left out to catch them. Cloths of white wool laid down because you can see them arrive. Alternate layers of blanket and straw shaken out daily. He writes about it the way a man writes about something he has personally lost several arguments to. The air of the room has a specific and permanent character, and dropped into it from a modern bedroom is the first thing that would floor you before the cold, before the dark, before the labour. It is wood smoke. First and always. Worked into the roof timbers and the clothes and the hair and skin of everybody present. Then damp wool, a smell people rarely describe accurately, sour and animal and faintly sweet. Because wool holds moisture for days and there is moisture in everything. Then the animals, if you're the sort of household that brings them in, which many are, a cow or an ox at the far end, a couple of pigs, hens roosting in the rafters and dropping things on people with no sense of occasion at all. Historians still argue whether the average peasant household really did share one roof with its livestock in a longhouse arrangement, or whether the beasts more usually stood in a separate byre across the yard, because the archaeology varies enormously by region and century, and the buildings themselves have mostly rotted back into the fields they came from. The floor is beaten earth, hardened by generations of feet strewn with rushes or straw that gets swept and replaced and in the corners doesn't. The roof is thatch, reed or straw or heather, whatever the district grows, laid over a timber frame and packed at the joints with whatever seals. In 1293 an English maidservant was paid 7p halfpenny for 5 days spent collecting moss, which sounds like the softest job ever recorded until you picture 5 days on your knees in wet woodland stripping moss off stone for 1.50 a day. Above the thatch there is no chimney. The smoke from the hearth rises, spreads across the underside of the roof, and leaves slowly through the thatch and the gable openings, kippering everything on its way, which is unpleasant for lungs and genuinely excellent for the roof, since a well-smoked thatch resists rot and vermin. Your ceiling is being cured, like a ham, with you underneath it. Now the fire, which is the actual first job and the one everything else waits on, it has not gone out. It must not go out, because relighting it from cold with flint and steel and tinder in a damp room in the dark is a slow and miserable business, and because the fire here is not a comfort, it is the stove, the lamp, the clock, and the heart of the house. So last night it was banked, the embers raked together, covered with ash to starve them of air and keep them alive and sulking until morning. That is where the word curfew comes from. Couvre-feu, cover the fire, the bell rung at night in medieval towns telling everybody to smother their hearths before the whole street burned down. The word now means teenagers being told to come home. It used to mean the difference between a town and a smoking hole, so you get up. The cold takes you the moment you leave the blankets, and there is no thermostat, no dressing gown, no shower waiting. You kneel at the hearth, rake the ash aside, Find the embers still red underneath and feed them. Kindling first, then split wood or gorse or dried dung, depending on what your district has and what you can afford. And then you get down on your hands and blow, low and steady, until the red climbs into flame and the smoke stops sulking sideways and starts rising properly. There is no clock. Not in this room, not in this village, possibly not in this county. Time here arrives as bells from the church, if you are close enough to hear them, and otherwise as light, and as the behaviour of birds and animals, and as the learned instinct of a woman who has done this every day of her adult life and knows, without knowing how, that it is late enough to start and not yet late enough to have failed. Your day is not divided into hours. It is divided into tasks, and the tasks are queued behind one another all the way to dark. The children are moving, of course they are. The moment the fire took, one of them sat up. You step over the smaller one, take a wooden bucket from beside the door and go out. The cold outside is a different animal from the cold inside. Cleaner, meaner, and it goes straight through the layers you're wearing as though it has been given directions. The well, or the stream, or the village pond is somewhere between 50 paces and half a mile away, and this is the first walk of many. A bucket of water weighs somewhere in the region of 30 pounds when it is full, and you're carrying 2, and water is the single most fetched. Substance in the medieval world because absolutely nothing happens without it. Cooking needs it. Ale needs it, in quantities that will horrify you later. Animals need it. Washing needs it. And every drop of it arrives on a woman's shoulders, one trip at a time, up the same path over the same stones in the same weather for her entire life. Nobody writes this down because nobody writes down breathing either. And then there is the laundry, and I want to be careful here. Because the word laundry in a modern mouth means a machine that beeps. What you're about to do is called bucking, and it is heavy industry. You start with ash. All year you have been saving the wood ash out of the hearth, because ash and water make lye, and lye is the only real detergent available to you. The linen goes into a great tub, the buck tub, layered in carefully, and over the top of it goes the bucking cloth, a coarse sheet that will hold the ash. Water is poured through the ash and the cloth so that it drips down through the linen below, drains out at the bottom, gets caught, gets carried back to the fire, gets reheated and gets poured through again, and again, and again, for hours, sometimes for days in shifts, with the household taking turns. And into that lye quite routinely goes stale urine, saved and kept for the purpose, because urine breaks down over time into ammonia, and ammonia lifts grease. That same elderly Parisian husband who worried so much about fleas keeps a warm pot of urine standing ready as a general household cleaning agent, and mentions it in the same brisk tone he uses for choosing a good eel. It is essentially the spray bottle under the sink. It works genuinely well. It does not, I'm sorry to report, smell any better for working well than the rinsing, which is more water, than the wringing, which is 2 women twisting a wet sheet in opposite directions until their forearms scream, then the drying, spread over hedges and bushes and grass, because a hedge is a drying rack that God installed for free. Here is the number that reframes the whole business. A full buckwash of the household linen happened perhaps a few times a year, not weekly, a few times a year. Because it consumed fuel, water, ash, daylight, and the entire labour of the women of the house for days at a stretch, and you did not spend that lightly. Your laundry basket in this world would not be a chore. It would be an annual festival. Which brings us to the thing everybody gets wrong about medieval people. The myth that they simply never washed, that they went about caked in filth and pretended not to notice. They did not. What they had was a completely different system. And the system was linen. Linen is the hygienic layer. It goes next to the skin, the shift, the shirt, the hose linings, the coifs and kerchiefs and sheets. And linen is what absorbs sweat and oil and dirt, and linen is what gets washed. Wool goes on top. Wool is the outer garment, the gown, the hood, the cloak. Wool is brushed and aired and spot-cleaned and mended and inherited. And wool is essentially never laundered, because washing wool ruins wool. So the medieval standard of cleanliness is not, is your gown clean? A question nobody asks, but is your linen white? A question everybody asks constantly and rather judgmentally. Clean white linen at the wrists and the throat is the entire visible signal of a respectable person, and they washed themselves too. Most people washed at home daily, hands and face at minimum, hands obsessively, especially before eating, because everybody eats with their fingers from shared dishes and there are rules about it. Beyond that, there was the public bathhouse, visited by a great many town dwellers something like once a week. Now the quirk, and it is a beautiful one. Bathhouses were very often built directly alongside bakeries, so the two could share the heat of the same oven. Two of the great pleasures of the medieval town: bread in a hot room, running off one fire. Inside you got steam, hot water, a scrub, a massage, a shave if you wanted one, and, because the line between comfort and medicine had not yet been drawn where we draw it, cupping and bloodletting as part of the same visit. You could come out clean, shaved, relaxed, and 2/3 of a pint lighter. Many houses ran separate hours for women, or separate rooms entirely, and the women went in numbers. Historians still argue whether the medieval bathhouse was primarily a bathhouse that developed a reputation, or primarily a place of business wearing a bathhouse as a coat, and the argument is not helped by the fact that the English word for a heated bath, stew, slid over the centuries into meaning something else altogether, which tells you which way the reputation eventually went. But you are not in a town, you are at a well in the cold, in the half-light, and the water has come up over your sleeve and soaked the linen against your forearm. Look at your hands. Really look at them. They are red to the wrist and cracked across the knuckles, and the skin at the base of the thumb is split and healed and split again, and this is January. And this is normal, and there is no cream, no glove, no evening when it gets better. Lye is alkaline. Alkali strips fat out of skin. Everyone's hands look like this. And your stomach, which has been politely quiet for about an hour now, chooses this moment to point out that nobody in this house has eaten anything at all, which is a problem with a very specific shape to it, because you cannot simply bake a loaf of bread. You are, in a great many manners across England and France, legally forbidden to bake bread in your own house. The Lord holds the bakehouse, the great domed communal oven, and tenants must bring their dough to it and pay him for the privilege. A fee taken in coin, or in a portion of the dough, or in one loaf out of a batch. It is the same arrangement as the Lord's mill, where you must grind your grain and pay for it, and it produces the same permanent low-grade fury. You may not bake bread in your own home. You may, however, pay a man to let you bake it in his. There is a practical logic underneath the greed, and where no lord is squeezing them, villagers arrange the same thing among themselves anyway, pooling fuel and firing one big wood-fired dome oven for everybody, because a bread oven is a monster that must be heated for hours before it will bake anything at all, and heating one oven for 20 households is sane, while heating 20 ovens is a way of turning a forest into a village of very tired people. Historians still argue whether the bakehouse monopoly was mainly a revenue device, squeezing an unavoidable daily need for reliable income, or mainly a fire regulation, since the surest way to lose a street of thatched roofs in an afternoon is to let everybody keep a roaring oven under their own. So what actually sits over your fire this morning and most mornings is pottage. And pottage is not a peasant hardship dish the rich escaped. Pottage is the standing daily staple of medieval Europe from the poorest cottage to the top table of the castle, and the only real difference between the two is what gets thrown in. It is a pot of grain and pulses, oats, barley, beans, peas, simmered soft with herbs and greens from the garden, and whatever else is available, which at the bottom means very little, and at the top means good stock and saffron and almonds and a name in French. The pot rarely comes off the fire entirely. You add to it, you take from it, you add again. It is never empty, and it is never quite the same twice, which is either comforting or unnerving depending on your temperament. Bread, when there is bread, does double duty. A thick slab cut from a coarse dark loaf baked a few days earlier, so it has gone firm, is laid on the table and used as the plate. That is the trencher. You pile food on it. It soaks up the juices, and at the end of the meal it has become the most flavourful item on the table. So it goes to the poor at the gate or to the dogs, or if it has been a lean week, straight into you. It is the only dinnerware ever invented that solves the washing up by being eaten. Now, the phrase you will hear for work like this is inside work, as opposed to the men's outside work, and that phrase has done more damage to how people picture medieval women than almost anything else, because inside does not mean indoors. Inside means inside the boundary of the household property. It means the yard, the byre, the dairy, the garden, the hen house, the woodpile, the pond, the hedge, and the strip of land at the back. It is outdoors, in the weather, all day, carrying things. So, the milking, morning and evening, sat on a low stool with your forehead against a warm flank. The dairy, which is a genuine craft, separating cream, churning butter until your shoulders burn, salting it, pressing cheese, turning cheese, managing a room that must be kept cool and clean, or the whole product spoils and a season's work is gone. The poultry, which are yours, your birds, your eggs, and in many households your money, because eggs were sold and the coin came back to the woman who kept the hens. The garden, the croft, the kitchen plot, where the leeks and cabbages and onions and beans and herbs come from. The foraging, nuts, berries, greens, herbs, rushes, bracken. The firewood, gathered and carried, generally on your back. A 13th century estate management treatise called the Seneschalcy sets out what the dairymaid is expected to do, and the list is worth hearing, because it is not a list about milk. She keeps the dairy, makes the butter and cheese, and looks after the vessels and keeps them clean. She also supervises the poultry, she also winnows the grain. That is the job description. Dairy, birds, and threshing floor, all one woman, all one wage. And here is that wage, and I want you to sit in it for a moment, because it is one of the coldest little sums in English record-keeping. At Cuxham in Oxfordshire, in the accounting year 1278 to 1279, the manor's dairymaid was paid a quarter of mixed grains every 14 weeks, plus 4 bushels of wheat and 4 bushels of barley. Grain. All of it grain. No cash at all. Not a penny, not a farthing, nothing that could be saved or spent on anything that was not grain. Value it out and you get roughly 13 shillings and 9pence for a year of work. A year's basic subsistence for one adult, the bare respectable minimum of food, fuel, light, and cloth, cost about 15 shillings and 8pence, so do that subtraction slowly. Her entire annual wage for running the dairy and the poultry and winnowing the grain came to about 2 shillings less than the cost of keeping one person alive for a year. She was not underpaid in the modern sense of being unable to get ahead. She was, on paper, unable to break even by feeding only herself, which tells you the wage was never designed to support a person. It was designed to top up a household, and the household made up the difference out of everything else she did, unpaid, in the hours around it. The pot is on the fire now, the pottage is thickening, and for about 90 seconds your hands are free, which is exactly why there is a stick tucked into your belt. It sits at your back, angled up over your left shoulder, wrapped around with a soft cloud of combed wool or dressed flax, pale, fibrous, faintly greasy to the touch if it is wool, cool and papery if it is linen. It is called a distaff, and it is doing a job that has nothing to do with spinning technique and everything to do with the arithmetic of a woman's day. It is holding the fibre supply for you. It is functionally a third arm, and because it is a third arm, both of your actual arms are free. That single design decision is the reason spinning became the most portable work in Europe. Because with the distaff belted at your waist, you draw fibre out with one hand and set the spindle turning with the other, and the spindle drops and twists and hangs and turns, and you feed and you draft and you wind on, and none of it requires you to sit down or stay still or look at what you're doing, or be anywhere in particular. So women spun while walking to market. They spun while riding. They spun while minding sheep and cows and geese, while running errands between houses, while standing in the garden waiting for a pot to boil, while watching a toddler who could not be left alone but also could not be, watched with any real attention for more than 11 seconds at a time. Medieval multitasking, except the thing being multitasked was the entire clothing supply of a continent. It became so completely the emblem of women's work that the language absorbed it. The female line of a family, your mother's people, your grandmother's people, the whole inherited half of a family tree, there's the distaff side, still is, in wills and heraldry and old legal language, an entire lineage named after a stick. And the reason it had to be constant is that the numbers are brutal. Thread is consumed by cloth at a rate that people who have never made cloth cannot really picture. Every single thing that anybody in this village is wearing, shirts, shifts, hose, gowns, hoods, cloaks, blankets, sheets, sacks, sails, bandages, altar cloths, shrouds, began as thread, and every inch of it was drawn out of raw fibre and twisted by hand. Not a bolt of cloth, a garment. One plain woolen gown swallows miles of yarn. Warp threads run the entire length of the cloth, and there are hundreds of them side by side, and then the weft crosses back and forth over all of them. Hundreds of times per foot. Do that multiplication and you're talking about weeks of a woman's spare hands to clothe one person once. which is why one weaver, working steadily, could strip several spinners bare of thread and stand there waiting for more. Historians still argue whether it took 3 spinners to keep one weaver supplied, or closer to 10 because it depends entirely on the fineness of the thread, the fibre, the tool, and how much of the spinner's day belonged to somebody else. But every estimate points the same way, which is that the bottleneck of the entire European textile industry was women's fingers, and everybody knew it, and nobody paid for it properly. Here is a small telling detail. Spinning wheels arrive in Europe during the 13th century, and they are faster, considerably faster. And yet in a number of towns, the weavers' regulations refuse to allow wheel-spun thread to be used for the warp, because early wheel yarn was judged weaker and less even than yarn spun on a hand spindle. So the new machine got the easy work. The old stick kept the hard work, and the woman with the distaff at her belt stayed exactly where she had always been. Technology arrived and it did not rescue her. It just gave her a second job to be underpaid for. And underpaid it was. Spinning was generally piecework, paid by the weight of thread delivered, and it sat among the very lowest paid work available to anyone. For a sense of scale, at Glimpton in Oxfordshire in 1324, 2 women spent 12 days cleansing wheat in the sheaves for sowing, and were paid 1 shilling and 6pence between them. 3 farthings each per day, 3/4 of a penny. That was field work in daylight at a fixed rate, and it was still less than a penny. Spinning paid from the same shallow well, and it was done in the gaps between everything else, at dusk by firelight, one-handed with a child on your hip. Meanwhile, the cloth those threads became was the largest industry in Europe. English wool going to Flanders, Flemish cloth going everywhere. Fortunes, guilds, wars, customs duties, whole cities. Ghent, Bruges, Florence, Norwich, built on the back of it. And in the cities where the work got organised into recognised crafts, women's names finally surface. Cologne had 4 craftswomen's guilds, yarn makers and silk makers and silk spinners and gold spinners, among the only entirely female guilds in Germany. In Paris, the late 13th century had 93 silk throsters wealthy enough to be assessed for tax, along with silk combers and gold spinners with proper trade names of their own. But those are the ones who lived in a city with a clerk. Out here, in the village, the spinning appears in the record almost nowhere at all. There is no wage entry for it, no contract, no tally. The wool leaves the manor as fleece and comes back as cloth in the middle of that sentence. The thousands upon thousands of hours in the middle of that sentence is simply not written down, because it happened in kitchens and yards and lanes, in fragments by women who were also doing 4 other things. So you spin, and you will not finish because nobody finishes. There is no bottom to the basket, and the basket is not a metaphor. But not right now. Right now you wind the last length onto the spindle, tuck the distaff down out of the way, and set it aside, because the grain has been steeping since yesterday, and the mash tun is waiting, and the ale in this house is not going to brew itself. And the mash tun is waiting, which sounds like a soft sentence and is not one, because a waiting mash tun means the largest vessel in the house is already sitting over the fire with water in it, and water is heavy, and she has carried every drop of it in from the well herself. On a yoke that has worn a permanent shine into the shoulders of her gown, the barley began weeks ago, soaked until it was thoroughly convinced spring had arrived, spread across a floor to sprout, turned by hand so it did not knit itself into one warm damp mat, and then, at a moment nobody has ever managed to put into words, dried over a low fire to kill the growing. That is malt. The sprouting wakes the sugar sleeping inside the grain, the drying stops it there mid-yawn, and everything afterwards is one long argument about how to get the sugar out again. So the malt is ground coarse and goes into the tun, the hot water goes in on top, and she stirs with a wooden paddle as long as her arm. This is the mash. It looks, if you are honest, like porridge that has quietly given up on its own future. She holds it at roughly the heat of a very warm bath, by hand and by instinct, because there is no thermometer anywhere in England. Her wrist is the instrument. Then the sweet liquid is drawn off through a bed of straw laid across the bottom of the tun, and that liquid is the wort, and the wort is boiled, and cooled in wide shallow vessels, and the cooling is the dangerous part because everything drifting through a 14th century yard is intensely interested in a large open tub of warm sugar water. Then in goes the balm, the pale, foaming scum skimmed off the last good batch and kept back like a family heirloom. It is living yeast, though nobody in this brewhouse knows that, and nobody will for another 500 years. What they know is that you save it, that you lend it to a neighbour whose own has failed, and that sometimes, for reasons nobody can name, it simply declines. And what comes out of all this is not a luxury. It is food. The ale everybody drinks daily is weak, thin, faintly sour, brewed to be swallowed by the quart rather than admired, and it is drunk by absolutely everyone, labourers and monks and grandmothers and children, because it delivers calories and because it has been boiled, which nobody here phrases as a public health measure, but which is functionally exactly that. A gallon a day for an adult is an unremarkable allowance. You're impressed. Nobody else is. There are no hops in it, because hops arrive later, out of the Low Countries, greeted at first with a suspicion normally reserved for foreign politics, and without hops ale does not keep. 4 or 5 days and it turns. So brewing is not an event. It is a tide, a weekly rhythm rolling across the village, one household's batch souring as another's comes good, and it fails, constantly. Wild yeast gets in, or the vessel's sour, or the weather turns muggy, or the barm goes sluggish, and the batch comes out flat and sharp and unsellable, and the loss is counted in grain the household could otherwise have eaten. Nobody can see the cause, because the cause is far too small to see, so it gets explained in the only terms available: bad luck, a bad neighbour, a curse, a moment of pride that God happened to notice. Historians still argue whether the unpredictability of medieval brewing came mostly from wild yeasts colonising the wort, or mostly from temperature and unclean vessels, and the honest answer is that every ruined batch took its reason with it. Which brings you to Marjorie Kemp of Lynn, who was, by her own extremely confident account, one of the greatest brewers in the whole town. She says so herself in her own book, with very little hedging, and for a while it was simply true. A burgess's daughter with capital and standing, doing what capable wives in her position did, and doing it well. Then her ale began to go flat. Not once, but again and again. The barm would rise and then fall away, the froth sinking back into the tun, and a batch that looked perfect at dusk would be worthless by morning. It happened so often that her servants left her, on the reasonable grounds that they had never seen anything like it, and would rather not keep watching. After 4 years she gave the brewing up. Then she bought 2 horses and set up a horse mill grinding corn for the townspeople. Sensible, diversified, and the horses refused. Not lamed, not sick, not underfed. They were harnessed and led to the mill and simply declined to pull. The man she hired to drive them tried everything he knew, gave notice, and went about Lynn telling everyone exactly what had happened, which cannot possibly have helped. She read both collapses the same way, as God dismantling her business interests deliberately, one enterprise at a time, until she paid attention. Whether that is theology or the most dramatic resignation letter in English history is a question of taste. But do not mistake her for a woman with no other option, because that is the caricature and it is wrong. At Brigstock in Northamptonshire, 74% of the women recorded as brewing were married women with living husbands, not widows, not the desperate. Brewing was a wife's trade, running alongside a husband's, an ordinary thread of ordinary household income, and at the top end it scaled. In 1333 the household of Elizabeth de Burgh, Lady Clare, was brewing 8 quarters of malt a week, close to 60 gallons of ale, for a household that drank it the way you drink tap water. That is not a cottage sideline. That is logistics, and this batch tonight works. She dips a cup and tastes it and does not smile, because smiling at your own ale is asking for trouble. Then she takes a long pole with a bush of green tied to the end of it, carries it out to the front of the house, and pushes it out over the street above her door. And that bush on a pole is not only an advertisement, which is what you assumed, standing there watching her wedge it into place. It is a declaration. It tells the street that there is fresh ale in this house today, and it tells the law exactly the same thing at exactly the same moment, and the law is already walking up the lane with a jug, because ale is food, and bread is food, and the medieval English state has taken the view that the price of food is not entirely the seller's private business. The assize of bread and ale ties the price of both to the price of grain, so that when corn is dear, the loaf shrinks and the ale is dearer by a fixed and public calculation, and when corn is cheap, the reverse. It is clumsy, constantly out of date, and in principle one of the most striking pieces of consumer protection anybody attempts before the modern age. London's assize of 1266 fixes the strongest ale in the city at 4 gallons for a penny, which sounds to you like a misprint and is not, and which explains a great deal about medieval literature. Enforcement runs through the Alatasters, who are local men, elected, barely paid, whose job is to go round tasting. You would like to think this is a coveted post, and it very much is not, since it mostly involves walking into a neighbour's yard and telling her that her ale is thin. Twice a year at the Great View of Frankpledge, or every 3 weeks at the ordinary Manor Court, the ale-tasters stand up and present the brewers, reading out the names of everybody who has brewed for sale since the last court. Everybody. The honest and the dishonest, the good ale and the bad, all read out together in one long list, and nearly all of them pay. That is the part that takes a moment to sit with. The amercement, the small fine, is levied so routinely and so universally that it stops looking like a punishment at all, and starts looking like something else entirely. A fee paid for the privilege of trading, collected twice a year by a manorial court that has quietly invented a licensing system without ever admitting that it has done so. Historians still argue whether those endless assize amercements should be read as genuine penalties for genuine offences, or simply as a licence fee dressed up in the language of crime, and the answer probably shifts from manor to manor and from one bad harvest to the next. What you can read straight off the rolls, though, is the economics. Some Brewsters appear again and again and again, paying the fine every single time, year after year, never once adjusting their price to the assize, which tells you, without anybody having to write it down, that the fine was smaller than the margin. Joan of Pudding Lane appears in the London courts 47 times between 1300 and 1315 for price violations, which is roughly 3 times a year for 15 years, and which is not the record of a woman who cannot follow the rules. It is the record of a woman who has done the arithmetic and found the rules affordable. The system does have teeth further down the escalation mind. Persistent offenders can lose the right to brew, and the truly persistent can meet the ale stake pillory, standing in public where the ale stake would ordinarily hang, which is a punishment designed to be seen by exactly the customers you are hoping to keep. Medieval justice is rarely interested in privacy, and sometimes the trade pushes back collectively and with startling nerve. At Exeter in 1317, the city's Brewsters combined. They took down their ale signs, all of them, and refused to sell any ale at all, in protest at restrictions being placed on their trade. A whole city, in a century when the water is not to be trusted, discovering overnight that its beverage supply was in the hands of an organised group of women who had decided to stop. You may imagine the mood in the council chamber. You may also imagine the mood in the taverns. By the early 15th century, some of them are inside the institutions. The London Brewers Guild around 1420 has a membership roughly 1/3 female, and these women join as individuals under their own names, even when they are married and therefore, in theory, legally submerged in their husbands. Some join jointly with a husband, and here is the detail that will delight you at 1 in the morning. A number of those husbands are not brewers. They do not brew, they have never brewed, they have no intention of brewing. They appear on the guild roll purely to assume public liability for a business their wives run, which is the medieval equivalent of co-signing a lease and then never once visiting the property. Then the door closes, slowly over about a century without anybody passing a law to close it. By 1500, the women of that guild no longer pay quarterage even jointly with a husband, and the only women being admitted at all are widows, holding a place rather than making a career of it. By 1600, most brewers in London and in a great many other towns are men. Nobody banned women from brewing. What happened instead was that brewing got bigger, and beer with hops kept longer, and therefore travelled further and therefore rewarded scale. And scale required capital and premises and credit and a guild seat, and every one of those was easier for a man to acquire. And so the trade drifted out of the yard and into the warehouse, and the women were left behind by an economy that never once said their name. But that is 150 years away and utterly invisible from here, where the ale stake is up and the first customers are coming through the gate, and where she counts out the fine from the last court without a flicker, the way you pay for parking. And then she loads a covered jug, and a basket of the small stuff into a barrow, because tomorrow is market day, and market day is where the real money is, and she wants a decent pitch. The market is loud before you can see it. That is the first thing. You come up the road and there is a sound like weather. A low continuous churn of voices and hooves and somebody's geese, and then the gate, and then it hits you all at once. The noise and the smell and the sheer horizontal density of people. Everybody selling, everybody perfectly certain they were there first. She pays the toll for her pitch and she takes it. And the pitch matters more than you would think. A stall in the flow of traffic sells. A stall behind the fishmonger sells rather less, for reasons that require no explanation. She sets out her jug and her measures, and the measures are the important part, because a measure is a claim, and a claim can be checked, and being caught short measuring in a market where everybody knows your face is a very expensive afternoon. Then the haggling starts, and haggling is not a colourful detail here, it is the actual mechanism. There is no price on anything. The price is discovered loudly, one transaction at a time. And it moves with the hour and the weather and how much of the batch is left and whether the buyer looks like she has anywhere else to go. A woman selling in a medieval market is doing arithmetic and psychology simultaneously, at speed, all day. And by mid-afternoon she's doing it with a voice like a hinge. Much of this end of the trade is hucksters, and the huckster is worth a moment. She buys small quantities and resells them smaller. Ale by the jug, fish by the handful, fruit, salt, thread, whatever moves. It is retail at the very bottom of the ladder. It takes almost no capital, and it is overwhelmingly women. The word is already faintly sour in the record. The way words for women's work have a habit of going, and it will keep curdling for another 600 years until it means what it means now. And there are rules, real ones, with courts behind them. Forestalling is buying goods before they reach the market, out on the road before the price is public. Regrating is buying in the market and reselling in the same market at a higher price. Both are prosecutable offences, and the theory is that the market must be a single open place where the price forms in front of witnesses, and anyone who intercepts that process is stealing from everybody at once, which is a genuinely radical economic idea, and it is being enforced by men in a muddy square in the reign of Edward III. In 1367, the York alewife Isabella Baker was prosecuted for forestalling, and her particular offence was this. She went out and met customers on their way to buy from rival Brewsters, and sold to them first, before they ever arrived. Which is, depending on how you look at it, a serious breach of the peace of the market, or the invention of the sales funnel. Historians still argue whether prosecutions for forestalling and regrating were really consumer protection, or mostly a convenient weapon for established traders to use against the aggressive newcomer undercutting them. And it is entirely possible for a single prosecution to be both at once. What all of it rests on, though, is reputation, and reputation here is not a soft thing. It is infrastructure. Almost nobody pays cash for everything. The trade runs on credit, on a slate, on the assumption that you are good for it. And that assumption is maintained entirely by what your neighbours say about you when you're not in the room. Which means a woman's business can be destroyed in a week by talk, and not necessarily by talk about her ale. In 1413, a Canterbury Brewster named Christine Colmere lost her trade because a man called Simon Daniel told her neighbours she was leprous. It was not true, it did not need to be true. Leprosy in this world carries formal legal exclusion and physical separation, and in some places a rite marking the sufferer as dead to the community, and once the word is out into the lanes there is no arguing it back in. Nobody buys ale from a woman they have been told is leprous. The rumour needed one afternoon. Her business had taken years. So she sues, in the church courts, because defamation is a spiritual offence and the church courts are where it lives, and she is not remotely alone in that. By the later 15th century, defamation suits make up about a third of all church court business in London, and in one study of 102 cases across Wisbech, London and Durham, 77 concerned women. These are not aristocrats defending honour in the abstract, these are working people defending their ability to sell things. The recorded insults are vivid enough that scribes wrote them down verbatim in the middle of otherwise pious Latin, including a 15th century York case turning on the phrase tup-assed queen, a tup being a ram, which tells you the insult was about breeding and that the clerk rather enjoyed his afternoon. And if you walk up the hill, out of the food market and towards the mercer's end, the same offences reappear wearing much better clothes. In 1368, the London silk women petitioned the mayor and aldermen against Nicholas Sarduchet, a Lombard merchant who had been forestalling and regrating all the crude and coloured silk brought into the city by aliens, buying up the whole supply before it could reach the open market and, in the petition's own phrase, thus grievously enhancing the price. And they told the mayor plainly that they had no other means of livelihood than their craft. Sit with that petition for a second. These women have no guild. Several of them are married and therefore have in law no independent standing whatsoever. And they have collectively identified a market manipulation, named the manipulator, described the mechanism accurately, and filed against him in the highest civic forum in London. Whatever they lacked, it was not a grasp of how the market worked. You leave them to it. Out through the gate, past the last of the carts, past a man having a difficult conversation with a pig, and the noise drops away behind you, and the road opens and there is nothing ahead but fields. And the fields in August are not restful. That is the illusion you brought with you from the paintings. In reality, the whole village has been mobilised. Everyone who can hold a tool and quite a few who cannot, because the corn is ready now, and ready means now, and the weather in this country has opinions. The first thing you notice is that the work is divided by the tool. Barley and oats are mown with the scythe, and the scythe is men's. Wheat and rye are reaped with the sickle, and the sickle is women's or men's, whichever hands are available. That is the line, and it holds with striking consistency across the country, and once you have seen it, you cannot stop seeing it. Watch the difference. The mower stands upright and swings, and the scythe takes a wide arc and lays the crop over in a swathe, and it is fast. And it needs a long reach and a rhythm you can hold for hours, and a blade kept lethally sharp with a stone carried at the hip. The reaper bends. The sickle gathers a handful of stalks and cuts them close, and the reaper straightens and bends again, and does that several thousand times before dark. Mowing is quicker per acre. Mowing is also, and this will not surprise you, the best paid job in the harvest, and it is closed to women entirely. Historians still argue whether the scythe was withheld from women by pure custom, or whether it reflected real differences in the sustained load of a 14-hour mowing day. And the awkward truth is that the effect on her purse was identical either way. But everything else she does, she reaps, she rakes, she binds the cut corn into sheaves with a twisted band made of the corn itself, which is a small mechanical trick she learned before she could read, if she ever learned to read. She stands the sheaves up together into stooks so the wind can dry them and the rain runs off, and she carries, and she loads. And across 11 estates studied together, women supplied 55% of the labour in the grain harvest. Not a supporting role, more than half. And then the pay. Reaping, a man gets 8 pence a day, a woman gets 5. Haymaking, a man gets 6 pence, a woman 4. Same field, same hours, same crop, same weather, and the sheaves do not fall over differently depending on who bound them. Which is why you should stop for a second on weeding. Weeding is women's work almost absolutely. On 5 of 10 estates examined, it was more than 97% female. Women and girls going through the standing corn with hooks, pulling out thistle and cockle and charlock. And where both sexes did it, they were paid the same, exactly the same. So the gap is not some rule that a woman's hour is worth less than a man's. The gap tracks the job, and the jobs were sorted by sex first, and only then priced. When the sorting broke down and men turned up in the weeding gang, the rates simply sat there, equal, and nobody appears to have found it remarkable enough to comment on. There is more autonomy in this than the wage table suggests too. By the 16th century you find women taking harvest work as subcontractors, gangs with a named leader, paid by the acre rather than by the day. At Wallerton in 1541, just past the edge of the world you're walking through, every single subcontractor in the wheat harvest was a woman. The accounts record Elizabeth Heath and her fellows, who harvested 8 1/4 acres, and Belly's wife and her fellows, who did 9 1/4 at 8 pence the acre. Elizabeth Heth is named, Belay's wife is not, and you can feel the clerk shrugging across 500 years. The record is full of these fragments if you look. At Glimpton in Oxfordshire in 1324, 2 women were paid 1 shilling and 6pence between them for cleansing the wheat in sheaves for sowing, work that took 12 days, and the account carefully specifies that each one was taking by the day 3 farthings. 3 farthings. 3/4 of a penny. Somebody sat down with a quill and worked that out and wrote it into a manorial account. And it survived 700 years, and it's very nearly the entire visible economic life of 2 women whose names nobody bothered to record. And then, when the last cart is off the field, comes the part you like best, gleaning. The customary right of the poor, the young, the old, and above all women to walk the stubble after the harvest and take whatever the reapers dropped. It is not charity and it is not theft. It is a right, ancient and defended, and in some parishes it was announced by the ringing of the church bell to tell the gleaners the field was open, which means somewhere out there is a woman listening for a bell that means grain. A patient gleaner working a good field could gather enough across a season to make a real difference to a winter, and gleaning gangs had their own etiquette and their own furious internal politics about who went in first. the right lasted an extraordinarily long time. It was not finally broken until 1788, when an English court held in steel against Houghton that no person has at common law a right to glean in the harvest field, and switched off a custom older than most of the buildings in the parish. But that is centuries off, and here in the stubble the light is going gold and the last sheaves are up, and the bailiff is coming down the field with his tally stick, and there is a woman standing directly in his path with her arms folded, and she is not moving. She has been reaping since first light. She wants the same as the man beside her, and the bailiff, who has heard this before and is already tired, tells her what he has always told her, and she tells him what the woman 2 villages over is being paid this week, and the whole field goes quiet to listen. And the reason she can stand there at all, arms folded, arguing in the open with a man holding a tally stick, is that 1/3 of the people who used to be standing in this field are dead. The plague came through, and it did not care about anybody's arrangements. It took reapers and mowers and lords and children, and when it had gone the fields were exactly as large as before, and the hands were not, and the oldest law in economics turned up to collect. Suddenly the labourer is scarce, and scarcity has a price, and every ploughman and dairymaid and casual reaper in England worked out within a season that they could ask for more and get it. Landowners who had spent generations complaining about idle peasants now found themselves competing for them, with money in public, which must have been character building. The state's response was immediate and in its way magnificently blunt. The Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, made permanent as the Statute of Labourers in 1351, held that every able-bodied person, man and woman both, under 60, without land or craft or other means of support, must accept service when offered, at the wages that had been usual before the plague. Servants were forbidden to leave before their term was up. Masters were forbidden to poach one another's workers with better offers. Excess wages were to be forfeit, and giving them was an offence quite as much as taking them. Note that the statute says "and woman." It says it explicitly, in the text, without a flicker of hesitation. When the state wanted to compel labour, it had no difficulty whatsoever in seeing women as workers, which is a clarity it managed to mislay every single time the subject turned to paying them. And there is a clause buried in it that matters more to women than any other, and it does not look like much. Service, the statute says, is to be contracted by the year, or by the other usual terms, and not by the day. That is it. That is the sentence. And it lands like a hammer because the entire post-plague gain for women was concentrated precisely in day work, in casual hiring, in turning up at a field gate in a scarce season, and naming a price to whoever needed hands that morning. A woman locked into a yearly contract has no leverage at all, because her rate was fixed last Michaelmas, and the world has changed since. A woman selling her labour by the day has leverage every single morning. So the law reached in and abolished the arrangement that was working for her. It did not go quietly. The enforcement records are full of women. In Wiltshire in 1349, women loom large in the lists of offenders, and Simon Penn found that half of everybody described in those records as a common labourer was a woman. Half. These are the ones who took the better wage or left the service or refused to be hired at the old rate and were hauled into court for it. And there is a detail in the enforcement record that stops you. Penalties fell on women who had travelled in groups to another town in autumn. At harvest, when service was available at home, that is the offence. Going somewhere, together, in a group, in the season when the going was worth most. Having presumably compared notes about where the money was, somebody looked at women organising their own labour migration and concluded that the correct response was a court date. Punishments could include whipping and the stocks, which is a very great deal of machinery to point at a woman who wanted an extra tuppence, and it largely failed. Court records across the following decades show reapers taking 6pence a day against a statutory rate of 2 or 3, which is not evasion at the margins. It is an entire market ignoring the law in broad daylight and paying the fine as a cost of doing business, exactly as the Brewsters did. Historians still argue whether the labour statutes genuinely suppressed wages for a generation, or whether they mostly criminalised a rise that was going to happen regardless, converting a national pay negotiation into a very long and very expensive series of court cases. But here is the number that matters, and it is the quiet one. Women's casual day rates did roughly double after the plague. In the first decade of the 14th century, an unskilled woman's day wage was a shade over a penny. By the 1370s it was nearer 2.5. Genuine, measurable, life-changing improvement. and the remuneration implied by annual service contracts, the food and the lodging and the small cash of a live-in servant stayed almost completely flat from 1300 all the way to 1500. 200 years. The greatest demographic catastrophe in European history, an entire continent's labour market turned upside down, and the woman on a yearly contract in a farmhouse got nothing out of it. Not less. Nothing. At Cuxham in Oxfordshire, where the accounts are good enough to watch it happen year by year, remuneration was back to its pre-1349 level by 1353, which is 4 years, which is barely long enough to have finished burying everybody. So the catastrophe paid out, but only to those free to sell their labour by the day and by the week and by the season. And that freedom was precisely the thing the law had been written to take away. The argument at the field gate ends the way those arguments end. He offers a little more than he meant to, and a good deal less than she asked, and she takes it, because the light is going and the alternative is nothing. But her daughter has been standing behind her the whole time, holding a rake, listening to every word and doing the arithmetic. 5 pence against 8, on the same field in the same hours, a yearly service that pays what it paid when her grandmother was born. A dead man's law telling her she may not sell a single day of her own labour. So that night she puts a spare shift, a comb, a needle, a little linen and 1 coin into a square of cloth, and ties the corners together and tells nobody, and sits in the dark waiting for it to be early enough to leave. She goes out through the village gate before the sky has settled on a colour, and the dogs do not bark because they have watched her walk past them her entire life and have never once found her worth the effort. The bundle rides on one hip, then the other, and by the 3rd mile she's worked out that the only comfortable way to carry it is the way that hurts a different part of her every 20 minutes. The road is churned mud, rutted deep enough to swallow a shoe, maintained by nobody and kept open purely by being walked on, and she is not alone on it. What is actually happening is a straggling traffic all going the same way, a carter, 2 arguing friars, a man driving 4 extremely reluctant pigs, and a great many of them are women her own age, with bundles of their own. Because when the clerks sat down in 1377 to count England for the poll tax, they produced, entirely by accident, one of the quietly revealing documents of the Middle Ages. The towns held proportionally more women than the countryside did, enough to sit up plainly in the arithmetic, town after town. And when you look at who was arriving rather than who was already settled, it sharpens. Into York, into Hull, into Colchester, women formed the majority of incoming migrants. The villages were exporting their daughters, every year 1 bundle at a time, and had been for generations without anybody thinking it worth remarking on. Where they land is not the good streets. In York in 1377 you can trace it almost lane by lane. The incoming women cluster on the periphery, in the cheap tenements and small rented cottages around the edges. If you are lucky and clever and healthy, you move inward over years, and the thing she is walking toward has a name far gentler than it is. Service, not servitude, and not a career either. Historians call it life cycle service because that is exactly what it was, a stage, not a class. In the north of England, and in York and across Yorkshire especially, girls went into service in their early teens, 12, 13, 14, and stayed in it, moving household to household as contracts ran out until their middle 20s. Then most of them married and stopped. Almost everybody passed through it. Almost nobody stayed. What service consisted of is worth being precise about, because the word has gone soft over the centuries. A contract, normally by the year, agreed at a term day. A bed, which frequently means a straw pallet on the floor of the room she works in. Shared with another girl who snores. Board, which is one reason servants look conspicuously better fed than the labouring poor outside the door. And a small amount of cash. How small? In the 1390s, a maidservant in a yeoman's household earned 10 shillings a year. A manservant in that same household, under the same roof, at the same table, working for the same master, earned £1, 20 shillings, precisely double. You're welcome to go looking for the extra 10 shillings worth of labour in his working day. It has not been itemised anywhere, and nobody appears to have thought to ask. The cash gets smaller still. On the Manor of Moat in 1474 and 1475, the average monthly cash payment to a woman servant was 16 pence. Everything else arrives as bed and bread, which is fine right up until the day you need something bread cannot buy. And then Agnes Atwood fell ill. She was ill for a month, and the accounts record the cost of lodging her through it. 2 shillings and 8 pence, 32 pence. 2 months of her cash wages spent entirely on being sick for 4 weeks. Somebody entered it in a column, ruled a line under it, and went on to the next item. Illness here is not a misfortune. It is an invoice. And now and then these accounts throw out something so specific it stops you where you stand. In 1293, a maidservant was paid 7p halfpenny for 5 days spent collecting moss. 5 days filling sacks with moss at 3 halfpence a day. The record does not say what the moss was for because the clerk assumed anybody reading would obviously know, which is precisely how most of history gets lost. So set the two halves side by side. Service gives her distance, wages that are hers however small, a bed that is not her mother's floor, and an end date. The contract runs to its term and stops, and if the house is unbearable she can leave and hire herself to somebody better. It also gives her no kin within a day's walk, a master with legal authority over her hours, a bed she loses the same afternoon she loses the job, and a labour statute at his shoulder saying she may not leave before her term is out. Historians still argue whether life cycle service was genuinely a ladder, a decade of independence, savings and real choice that let northern women marry later and marry more or less whom they liked, or whether it was simply an extremely cheap, mobile and disposable workforce that had been persuaded to think of itself as being in training for adulthood. And that same poll tax leaves one more number lying on the table. Roughly 60% of adult women in England were married. Turn it over, 2 in 5 were not. Widows, servants, women keeping their own households, women who looked at the arrangement carefully and declined. 2/5 of the time, the medieval woman is somebody nobody thought to paint. So the years go past in term days. Michaelmas, Martinmas, another kitchen, another mistress, another straw pallet, a slightly better wage, a little put by in a knotted corner of cloth. And then it is 10 years later, and she's 24, and she comes out of a doorway at the end of a working day with her sleeves still shoved up, and there is a man at the corner of the street who has obviously been there a while, and who has something to say to her. He does not have a ring. He may not even have a plan. What he has, and does not entirely understand that he has, is access to the single strangest piece of law in medieval Europe. Because here is the thing nobody tells you about medieval marriage, and it is genuinely hard to believe the first time you hear it. Consent made the marriage, not the ceremony, not the priest, not the church, not the banns, not the ring, not the feast, not the family, not the lord. Words, that was it. Words. Under the canon law of the Western Church, settled by the 12th century and holding firm for 400 years, if a man and a woman of age exchanged words of present consent, per verba de presenti, I take thee as my wife, I take thee as my husband, then they were married. Immediately, completely, indissolubly. In an orchard with nobody watching, in a kitchen with the pot on, in a barn on a street corner. No priest, no paperwork, because there was no paperwork to be had. The marriage existed the moment the sentence finished, and nothing on earth could afterwards take it apart. And there was a second door into the same room. Words of future consent per verba de futuro. I will take thee, created a promise rather than a marriage. But if the couple then went to bed together, that promise converted instantly and permanently into a full and binding marriage, because the church held that the act presumed the consent, which means the most consequential grammatical distinction in medieval Europe was the difference between the present tense and the future tense, and a remarkable number of people learned that point of grammar the hard way in a courtroom. Now hold both halves of the church's position at once, because the church held both quite happily for centuries. Marriages made this way were clandestine, and clandestine marriage was illegal. The church fined for it, thundered against it from pulpits, and insisted couples come to the church door and do it properly, in public. And in the same breath, the church held that a clandestine marriage was entirely valid, sacramentally perfect, and could not be undone by anybody at all, including the church itself, illegal and unbreakable, simultaneously, for 400 years. It is the most magnificent institutional shrug in European legal history. The consequences turn up where you would expect. The church courts of England fill up, not mostly with people escaping marriages, but with people trying to enforce them. A woman comes into court and says, he said the words, in his mother's kitchen, at about the hour of Vespers, and here are 3 neighbours who heard him. And the court takes her entirely seriously because if she can prove the words, she is married, and no family objection can lay a finger on it. which puts something into the mouth of an ordinary young woman that she has almost nowhere else in this century. A sentence that, once spoken and once proved, cannot be overruled by her father, her lord, her brothers, her employer, or her king. That is the power. The danger is the same fact with the light behind it, because the words work whoever says them and for whatever reason. A man who wants what he wants tonight can say the future tense version very sincerely in a doorway, and a girl who believes him can discover, months later, that he remembers the wording differently and that the two people standing nearby have since moved away. The system handed her a lever. It did not hand her a copy of the contract, and where she is standing on the map changes the shape of that lever. Draw a line across Europe running roughly from Trieste to St. Petersburg, the Hajnal line, named for the demographer who noticed it. North and west of it, in England, the Low Countries, northern France and Scandinavia, you find a marriage pattern genuinely unusual in world history. Women marry late, in their early to middle 20s. Men marry later still. The couple does not move in with his parents. They set up a separate household, which means they must afford one first, which is precisely why they spent the preceding decade in service, saving. And a substantial minority never marry at all, between 1 woman in 10 and 1 in 5. South and east of that line the pattern inverts. Marriage is early and near universal, and the bride does not found a household, she joins one with her husband's parents and brothers already in it, which is where the Florentine catasto arrives. In 1427, Florence conducted an enormous household-by-household tax survey, and the data buried inside it is astonishing. Mean age at first marriage for the women of the city, about 17 and a half. For the men, about 30. A gap of 12 or 13 years systematically as the ordinary norm. Think about what that does to a household before anybody in it has said a word. He has finished an apprenticeship, established himself, and formed a great many opinions. She has come out of her father's house directly into his, and he will very probably die first, which is why Italian cities are so full of young widows, and why a widow's money is among the most ferociously litigated questions in 15th century Italy. Now compare the girl on the York Street. 24, 10 years of her own wages behind her, being spoken to by a man in the awkward position of having to persuade her. He cannot go over her head to her father, who is 30 miles away and has no leverage inside these walls. The consent has to be hers, spoken aloud, and both of them know it. Historians still argue whether that northwestern marriage pattern was a cause of the region's later economic divergence. Late marriage, smaller families, women earning wages, or mostly a consequence of a post-plague labour market that briefly made a young woman's work valuable enough to be worth delaying a wedding for. So he says his sentence on the corner, and she thinks about it rather longer than he was hoping and says hers back. And 11 months later, the two of them are standing in front of a church court, because somebody has decided the words did not mean what she says they meant. The court sits in a room off the minster, and it does not look like justice. It looks like paperwork. There is a judge and proctors, who are lawyers wearing a different hat, and a scribe whose hand is already cramping, and no jury and very little drama. Witnesses are examined one at a time, separately in private, on oath. What they say is written down, and then it is filed and bundled and forgotten with tremendous thoroughness for 600 years, which is the only reason you can read it now. In York a great deal of it survived, and you can sit today in a reading room at the Borthwick Institute with the actual answers in front of you. The York Cause Papers are the richest surviving body of medieval English matrimonial litigation in the country, and they are not summaries or tidy legal abstracts. They are depositions, what this person said in reply to this question, about one particular afternoon years previously. Now consider what the court has to establish. If a marriage is made out of words, the court must find out precisely which words were said. Not the gist of them, the words. So the questions go like this. What exactly did he say? Say it again. In what language? Did he say, I take thee, or I will take thee? Where were you standing? Where were they standing? Was it before or after dinner? And how do you know? Did he take her right hand in his? Did anything change hands? A ring, a coin, a broken penny, a glove? Did they kiss? Did they drink afterwards? And what did they drink and who else drank with them? That last one is not the court-making conversation. In a world without paperwork, the drink is the paperwork. Sharing a cup in front of others is how ordinary people signalled that something binding had occurred, and a witness who remembers the ale is a witness who remembers a wedding. Somewhere in England there is a marriage that stood or fell on a jug, and the answers come back in the flat, circumstantial, gloriously specific voice of people trying very hard to be accurate. A woman deposes that the couple stood in the orchard, and that she was hanging linen and could see them over the hedge. A man deposes that the words were spoken in the hall after supper, that he carried the ale in afterwards, and that the fire was lit. Somebody remembers the day because it was the day the mayor was shod, which is why these documents matter far beyond the law. No other source in medieval England lets you into so many ordinary rooms. Chronicles record kings, manorial accounts record pennies, wills record possessions at the moment of death, which is not a representative moment. The cause papers record a Tuesday afternoon in somebody's kitchen. Who was in it? What was on the table? What a servant was doing over in the corner? And the sole reason any of it survives is that two people fell out about a sentence, and one of them sued. Your kitchen is preserved for eternity because your neighbour was nosy, and her memory was excellent. Historians still argue whether these depositions record what people genuinely said and saw, or what the proctors had carefully explained to them beforehand that the canon law needed to hear, because the witnesses are sometimes suspiciously fluent in precisely the details that would win the case. Take Alice de Rucliffe, heard at York in 1365. Alice came from the minor gentry, a girl with land attached to her, and the land is the engine of what follows. The question before the court was whether she was validly married to John Moraes, and the case turned on two things, neither of them romantic. The first was her age. Canon law set the age of consent at 12 for a girl and 14 for a boy. Below that, a contract could be made but not made final, and could be repudiated when the child came of age. So Alice's exact age at the moment of the contract was not a background detail, it was the whole case. And nobody had a birth certificate because birth certificates did not exist. So the court did what medieval courts always did and asked the neighbours how old she was, and they reconstructed it from memory, from the year of a flood, from whose child was born in the same season, from what they had been doing on the day she was baptised. The second question was whether the marriage had been consummated, because that was what converted a conditional contract into an unbreakable one, which is how you end up with sworn testimony from servants and neighbours about which room and which night, all set down in a scribe's careful Latin. It is an intrusion that ought to make you shift slightly in your chair, and it made nobody in that room shift at all, because an estate was resting on the answer, because that is the last thing to see clearly here, and it is the least sentimental. Read enough of these cases and you stop seeing a love story with a legal complication attached, and start seeing a legal problem with occasional love in it. Alice de Rucliffe had land. Somebody had bought her marriage, because wardship and the right to arrange an heiress's marriage were an asset, traded exactly like a lease. A contested marriage is therefore a contested inheritance, and the kin who turn up to swear are not neutral bystanders. They are on a side, and the side has an estate riding on it. And yet the doctrine holds. That is the remarkable part. However much money is standing quietly behind the case, the question the court keeps returning to is the question of consent. What did she say, and did she mean it? And was she old enough to mean it? The church built its edifice of marriage on the free will of two individuals, then spent 4 centuries watching wealthy families try to get around it, and mostly refused to let them. Which brings you to the most famous test of that doctrine in English history. And the reason we know about it is not a court roll at all. It is a family who could not stop writing letters to one another. The Parstons of Norfolk are new money and they know it, and it makes them exhausting. 3 generations earlier they were peasants. Then came a clever son, and law, and a good marriage, and land, and by 1469 they are gentry with a castle in the family and a great many enemies in the county, defending claims everybody regards as slightly too recent to be respectable. Nobody polices a boundary quite like somebody who crossed it within living memory. They also write letters, constantly about lawsuits and rents and who has said what about whom, and hundreds survive, which makes them the most intimately documented family in 15th century England entirely by accident, purely because they were anxious people with paper. And in 1469 they are having a bad year even by their own standards. The Duke of Norfolk has laid siege to their castle at Caister with guns. And in the middle of that, Marjorie Paston, the daughter of the house, quietly informs her mother that she has already exchanged vows with Richard Carley. Richard Carley is the family bailiff. He has run their estates for years, the rents, the accounts, the manors, the endless correspondence about who owes what, and he is extremely good at it. He is also, socially, staff, and the two of them have stood somewhere at some point, with nobody of consequence watching, and said the present tense to one another. The family reaction is instant and total. Margaret Paston, Marjorie's mother, is not a soft woman. This is someone who has held a manor house against armed men, and written coolly to her husband afterwards about needing crossbows. And she is appalled. So are Marjorie's brothers, and their horror is not about Calais' character, which nobody attacks, or his competence, which nobody can. It is about rank, undisguised. One of her brothers writes that Calais should never have his goodwill to make his sister sell candles and mustard in Framlingham. That is the objection, in full. Not that the man is dishonest, that the man is trade. So the family does what families do, they separate the couple, they keep Marjorie in the house. They apply pressure of every kind available to a 15th century household, which is a considerable amount, applied continuously by people who love her. Callie, cut off, writes to her anyway, and one letter survives. He calls her min own lady and masters, and before God very true wife. Before God, true wife. He is not being poetic. He is making a precise legal claim, and he knows exactly what he is claiming. And then the case goes where such a case must go, which is to the bishop. Walter Lehert, Bishop of Norwich, examines them, and he does it the clever way, the way everybody involved is quietly hoping will work. He examines them separately. He asks each of them, apart from the other, exactly what words they used, and when, and where. Because if the vows were a fantasy, or a misunderstanding, or a story got up afterwards, the two accounts will diverge. They always diverge. Two frightened young people, questioned separately by a bishop, produce two different versions. The whole thing collapses, and everybody goes home and never mentions it again. They didn't diverge. Margaret Paston's own letter describes the examination, which is how we know about it at all. Marjorie said her words plainly, and was reminded, kindly and at length, of precisely what she stood to lose, and said them again, and added that if those words did not make it sure, she would make it surer before she left the room. The bishop delayed. Everybody's lawyers went hunting for an impediment. None was found. He ruled the marriage valid. Sit with that, because it is the whole doctrine standing up in public and refusing to fall over. A powerful, litigious, well-connected gentry family, mid-war over a castle, brought the entire weight of its influence to bear on undoing a marriage between its daughter and its own employee, and could not do it. Two people had said words to each other. That was sufficient. That was, in fact, unanswerable, and Margaret Paston's response is the coldest thing in the whole correspondence, and she barely needed any words for it. She instructed her household that her daughter was not to be received in her house. The door shut. Not metaphorically. She gave the order to the servants. Marjorie, so far as the record shows, never came back inside it. And then comes the detail that makes the whole episode human and faintly absurd and impossible to forget. The Pastons kept Richard Carl on as bailiff. They did. The man they had spent months trying to prize off their daughter, the man they would not have at the table, the man whose social existence they had summarised as candles and mustard. They went on employing him because he was excellent at it, and they had nobody better. You may disown a daughter with a single instruction to the staff. You cannot easily replace a man who knows where all the rents are, which manor is behind, which tenant is lying, and where the deeds are kept. So the arrangement settles into something extraordinary. A family that will not open its door to its own child while relying every quarter on the financial competence of the husband. It refuses to acknowledge. Snobbery, it turns out, is a luxury good, and the Pastons could afford it right up to the point where it began interfering with the accounts. Historians still argue whether Margaret Paston's fury was straightforward snobbery or something colder, a calculated defence of a family whose claim to gentility was 3 generations old, contested in the courts and, that same autumn, by artillery, and for whom a daughter marrying downward was not an embarrassment but a piece of evidence their enemies could use. What it cost Marjorie is not recorded, because nobody in that family wrote letters about their sister's feelings. What she gained is a marriage the church upheld, children, a husband who called her his own lady and mistress in writing, and a life that was hers because she had said so, out loud, twice, to a bishop. And the reason any of it could happen is that in this world the words were free, the money never was. Money in a medieval marriage moves in one of 2 directions, and which way it flows tells you almost everything about where the woman in the middle of it ends up. Go south first, to Italy, where it flows toward the husband. The dowry is what a bride's family pays to get her married. her share of the patrimony, handed over in place of any later claim on the estate, administered by her husband and returned if he dies first. That is the theory, and the theory is elegant. The practice, after the Black Death, was inflation. Competition for good husbands pushed Italian dowries up decade after decade, the way prices rise in any market where the bidders all watch one another. A family with 3 daughters faced a bill capable of destabilizing the household, and everybody complained loudly and paid more the following year anyway, because the alternative was a daughter who did not marry. So in 1425, Florence turned the problem into a financial instrument, which no state had done. The Monte delle Dotti, the dowry fund. A father deposited a lump sum with the commune, naming a daughter, sometimes as young as 5, and the state paid a guaranteed compound rate of 11 or 12%. The deposit matured after 7 years, or 11, or 15, and on the day the girl married, the fund paid the accumulated sum straight to her husband. Federigo di Benedetto di Como deposited 200 florins. When his daughter Diamante married in 1440, it had grown to 1,000, 5 times the money, produced by nothing but time and the credit of the Florentine state. He named her Diamante and watched her appreciate, which is either the loveliest coincidence in the archive or a joke made at the christening. Roughly 30,000 girls were enrolled between 1425 and 1569, a city that turned its daughters into a bond market with maturity dates, yields, and inevitably terms and conditions. The original ones were brutally simple. If the girl died before her deposit matured, the commune kept the capital. Fathers objected at volume, and the rules softened. But for a long stretch of that century, a Florentine man could look at his daughter and see an investment that might not reach term. Historians still argue whether the Monte delle Dotti was a welfare scheme to rescue fathers from a ruinous marriage market, or an elegant way for the Florentine state to borrow, cheaply by dressing public debt up in a little girl's name. Now come north, where the money runs the other way. English dower is not what a bride's family pays out. It is what a husband's estate owes her. At common law, a widow was entitled to dower, a life interest in a share of her husband's lands, most commonly a third. Not a lump sum, not a pension, not a bequest a bad-tempered heir could argue about. A third of the land for life. And it is protected in the most famous document in English legal history, in a clause you have almost certainly never been told about. Magna Carta, 1215, remembered for barons in a meadow, and containing along the way a clause about removing fish weirs from the Thames, which tells you what those barons were really worried about. Clauses 7 and 8 are about widows. A widow shall have her marriage portion and her inheritance at once and without trouble, without paying, without waiting, without being made to plead for it from her husband's heir. She shall pay nothing for her dower. And then the line worth reading twice slowly. No widow shall be compelled to marry so long as she wishes to remain without a husband. In 1215, wedged in among the grievances of armed noblemen about scutage and forest law is a clause protecting a woman's right to say no, and keep saying it. It needed saying because the practice needed stopping. A widow holding a third of a decent estate was one of the most attractive pieces of property in England, and the Crown's right to arrange her remarriage had been a revenue stream for a century. Clauses do not appear in Magna Carta because somebody had a nice idea. They appear because somebody was furious. And then, having established all that, the law does the other thing, coverture. On marriage, a wife's legal personality merges into her husband's. She is covert de baron, covered by her lord. In law, the two are one person, and the one person is him. Without his express permission, she cannot make purchases, enter contracts, take leases, or bring a lawsuit. Not because anybody doubts she's capable, but because in law there is no longer a separate her to do it. She does not stop existing. She stops existing legally, which on a market day is the same problem. So a woman's legal life runs in a strange arc. Single and of age, she is a person in law. On marriage, she is absorbed. On widowhood, she is restored, with a third of his land attached and nobody able to compel her into another marriage. The freest woman in medieval England, in strictly legal terms, is a widow with property, and a startling number of the formidable women in this story got there by burying somebody. Which brings you back to a doorway, on an afternoon in autumn. The vows were said this morning at the church door in public, the way the church spent 4 centuries insisting on. Before the party went inside for the mass, there has been food, and a great deal of ale, and a walk through the streets with people calling out from doorways. And here is the house. It is not hers. It is his, or more probably his father's. Her chest is already inside, carried ahead by two men who set it down in the wrong place. Somebody is holding the door and everybody has gone quiet the way crowds do when waiting for one small thing. Behind her is 10 years of term days and straw pallets and wages knotted into a corner of cloth. Ahead of her is a third of the land one day, if she outlives him, which statistically she will, and in between, exactly one step wide, is the threshold. She lifts her skirt clear of the sill and steps over it, and the house takes her in the way a large coat takes a small person, completely, and with a great deal of spare room left over. She is 15. The floors are tiled, the hall is hung, there is a walled garden at the back and a well in the yard that is hers now, and servants standing in, a loose line trying to work out what she's going to be like. And somewhere in this building is a man of at least 60 who is her husband, and who is, at this exact moment, writing her a book. Not a note, not a list pinned to the pantry door, a book, and a long one. You know it as the Ménagier de Paris, the Goodman of Paris, put together around 1393 by a wealthy Parisian bourgeois whose name has not survived. For a bride roughly 40 years his junior, arrived from another town knowing, he says gently, very little about running a house of this size. And you brace, because you have read things like this before and know how the genre goes. You're expecting a lecture with a man's face on it. What you get is stranger, and sadder, and much harder to be angry at than you would like. Because near the beginning he tells her quite calmly that he is going to die first. He is old, she is young, this is not tragedy, it is arithmetic. And therefore, and this is the fact that quietly reorganises the entire book around itself, he's not training her to be a good wife to him, he's training her to be a credit to her next husband. He is preparing her in exhaustive detail for a household he will never stand in and a man he will never meet, and without one flicker of resentment, which is either the most generous thing anybody wrote in 14th century France or the most quietly devastating, and there is no rule saying it cannot be both. The first part is what you feared: religion, morals, mass and confession, how to walk in the street, how to hold your eyes, obedience from several angles. And there, sitting in it like a stone in a shoe, is Griselda, translated out of Petrarch, the wife whose husband takes her children away and lets her believe them dead, then casts her off, then summons her back to sweep the floors for his wedding to a younger bride, who turns out to be her own daughter. Griselda endures all of it, never complains, and the goodman sets it down for his 15-year-old with obvious admiration, and then, to his credit, steps back from it. Because even he can hear that the story has gone somewhere no reasonable husband should follow, and then the book turns, and you stop reading a conduct manual and start reading the most complete portrait of a working household to survive from the Middle Ages. Fleas. How to keep fleas out of the bed and the bedchamber, and he has methods. Several laid out with the settled enthusiasm of a man who has thought about fleas for years, and would like somebody to appreciate the thinking. Flies likewise, an entire campaign. Cunning and elaborate, involving cloths and threads and careful placement, and then, after the whole parade of ingenuity has marched past, one flat line at the end of it. Have paddles for killing them by hand, which may be the most human sentence in the book, and which is where every home improvement project ends up. How to choose the best eel, how to choose the best cheese, how to make invisible ink, how to turn white wine red, which is not a household necessity by any definition you would recognise, but is in there anyway, wedged between the gardening and the servants. How to hire servants. Manage them, check where they came from, let them go. Hawking. Menus for feasts course by course with quantities, for numbers of guests that make you want to sit down. And on buying rabbit delivered without any change of tone whatsoever, you can tell if he's tender by breaking one of his back legs. He also keeps a pot of urine standing warm as a cleaning agent, because the ammonia lifts grease, and because in a world without reliable soap, you use what the household produces. His moral instruction runs almost entirely through animals, dogs especially. He tells her the tale of Macaire and the hound that would not let its master's death go quietly. And the point, as ever, is loyalty, which he considers the finest quality available in either species and possibly better represented in one of them. Historians still argue whether the goodman's young wife was a real girl in a real Paris house, or a literary fiction, a frame invented to hang a manual on. And the honest answer is that nobody can produce her name. and that the book keeps forgetting to be literary at exactly the moments a fiction would remember, because he is fond of her. That is the thing that will not go away. He is anxious about her, pedantic at her, endlessly specific and plainly worried that when he is gone, she will be alone and untrained and judged by people less kind than himself. He tells her to keep her husband warm and dry and well-fed and well-shod, and it reads less like a rule than like a man describing the only form of love he has words for. The book is a cage. It is also an act of care. Both walls are made of the same material, and then you step outside into the street and hear what the rest of the world thinks of her, because the pulpit is not fond of anybody. The Dominican preacher John Bromyard in the 14th century offers his congregation the line that a beautiful woman is a temple built over a sewer. John Merck complains of women whispering in church, turning it into a labyrinth full of vain speech and filth, and underneath the sermons run the proverbs, worn smooth by repetition. Garrulous women are seldom chaste. Where there are women there are words, where there are geese there are turds. 600 pages of a husband's fussing, and one line from a friar, and only one of them is being read aloud on Sunday to everyone she knows. And none of that has the slightest thing to say about what actually happens next, which is that by the following summer the girl in the tiled hall is pregnant, and every single one of the authorities suddenly falls silent, because this is the one part of her life the sermons cannot follow her into. It begins with a suspicion and account. She misses her course and says nothing for a while because saying it out loud too early is asking for something. Then the sickness comes, and the changes come, and the women around her start looking at her differently in the market with a slight tilt of the head, the way you look at somebody carrying something heavy up a hill. She's told to avoid fright and sudden noise and looking at ugly things, because the child takes impressions from the mother, and if she stares at something misshapen it may come out shaped that way. She's also told to eat well, rest often, and not lift the buckets, which is excellent advice she will follow for as long as the household can spare her. And then, near the end, the room is prepared, and the room is the point. They shutter the windows, they hang the walls with tapestries or with whatever cloth the house can manage, sheets, coverlets, curtains taken down from elsewhere, until the plaster has vanished entirely and the chamber is soft on every side. They stop the keyholes, every keyhole. They build the fire up and keep it up, and they close the door, and the room becomes dim and warm and entirely enclosed. A small upholstered cave in the middle of an ordinary house, sealed against draughts and against light, and against whatever else it is that a keyhole might let in. And no men, none. Not the husband, not his brothers, not the priest, not the physician who has read all the books and never once attended a birth. He is downstairs somewhere, pacing, being handed things to do by people who have run out of things for him to do. This is the one door in her entire life he cannot open, and for a few days the house has a country inside it with its own government and no male citizens at all. Inside are the midwife and the gossips, and the word is not doing what you think it is doing. Gossip comes from God-sib, God-sibling, and these are the women who will stand as godparents to the child. Her mother, her sisters, her aunts, the women 3 doors down who have done this 6 times between them and know where everything is kept. Kin and neighbours, summoned formally, arriving with food and with opinions. The word only curdles later, over centuries into idle talk, and it curdles for reasons you can probably guess, given who was in the room and what men thought was being said about them in it. The joke writes itself and then quietly stops being funny. And then they go around the house undoing things. This is the part that will stay with you. Every knot in the chamber is untied. The laces of her gown, the cords of the bed, the drawstring on a purse, the ties on a bundle. Her hair is loosened and the pins are taken out and set aside. The cupboard doors are opened and left open. Chests are unlocked. Anything closed is opened. Anything bound is unbound. Anything fastened is unfastened. On the perfectly coherent logic that the world is full of sympathies, and that a body which must open should not be surrounded by things that are shut. There is no mechanism here. There is only the shape of the idea, and the shape is beautiful. And if you have ever tidied a room obsessively while waiting for news, you understand it completely. She does not deliver in the bed. She delivers on a birthing stool, a low seat with the front cut away in a crescent, so that she sits upright with gravity working for her, and the midwife kneeling in front and another woman braced behind her shoulders to take her weight. The bed is where she will rest afterwards. The stool is where the work is done. She may hold a stone or wear one bound against her, amber or sard or jasper. and before it goes on, it is rubbed against the inside of her thighs, which is thought to draw the virtue of the stone toward the pain and settle it there. The midwife is an older woman from 3 streets over. She learned this the way everything was learned, by standing at the elbow of another woman for years until her hands knew it, and she has done it more times than she can count and remembers more of them than she would like. Where the church takes an interest in licensing midwives, it examines them, and here is the detail that tells you everything about the century. The examination is barely about obstetrics, it is about character. Is she of good repute? Is she sober? Is she honest? Does she keep faith? And above all, can she perform an emergency baptism correctly, with the right words, on a child that is not going to live an hour? Because if the infant dies unbaptized, the soul is lost, and the soul outranks the body. And so the licensing authority is far more anxious that she can say the formula properly than that she can turn a shoulder. Historians still argue whether the sealed and darkened chamber was primarily medical thinking, keeping out bad air and sudden chills in a body they believed dangerously open, or primarily ritual, a deliberate separation of the mother from the ordinary world, and the likeliest answer is that nobody in the room drew a line between the two, because nobody in the room needed one. What you notice, standing where you're not supposed to be standing, is how warm it is. Not just the fire, the steady, undramatic competence of 6 women who have all done this, and who are talking about something else on purpose, and who between contractions are eating, because it will be a long night and somebody sensibly brought bread. And then there is a knock, and the door opens the width of a hand and something wrapped in linen is passed through it from the street. It is longer than it looks. Unrolled across the bed, it runs the length of a grown woman, and then some, a strip of parchment sewn end to end from several skins. Dark with handling, the ink faded at the folds where hundreds of fingers have opened and closed it in exactly the same places. A birth girdle. It carries prayers and holy names and crosses, and often a drawn line labelled as the measure of the body of Christ, or of the wound in his side, or of the nails. And the point of the measure is that a measurement is a real quantity, a true thing carried from a true body, and truth in this world has force. Some are painted, some have little images at intervals, saints standing in the margin like people waiting at a bus stop. And the girdle does not belong to her. It belongs to the abbey up the road which rents it out. That is not a slander, and it is not a joke. Monasteries and parish churches kept these rolls in the treasury alongside the plate, and hired them to women in labour, for a fee or an offering. And the roll came back afterwards to be lent to the next one. It was a service and a revenue stream, and the only functioning maternity provision the district had. All at once. Somewhere there was a monk whose job included knowing where the girdle currently was. The great ones were relics. Fragments and copies of the girdle of St. Margaret circulated as birthing aids across Europe, and Margaret of Antioch is the patron. Saint of childbirth on the strength of a legend in which she was swallowed whole by a dragon and burst out of it alive and unharmed. Which is, when you sit with it for a second, exactly the metaphor a labouring woman would want, and precisely the one nobody would dare invent today. And at St. Peter's, Westminster, they kept a girdle of the Virgin, which was brought out and used by Eleanor, wife of Henry III, because queens are not above borrowing. And here is where the story reaches forward and touches you. There is a roll in the Wellcome collection, Western MS 632, English, late 15th century. It is stained. Anybody could see that. Rolls like this are always stained, and for centuries the stains were simply what old parchment looks like. Then in March 2021, a team published a biomolecular analysis of it, lifting proteins straight off the surface, and the results were not ambiguous. Human proteins consistent with cervicovaginal fluid. And alongside them, honey, cereals, sheep and goat milk, and legumes, every one of which appears in the written medieval remedies for labour. Which means the roll was not hung on a wall or laid respectfully on a chest. It was worn, pressed against the body, against skin through the whole thing, by a woman with a name that no longer exists, whose fear is now the only surviving chemical record of her, 500 years later, on a shelf in London. Because the fear was not decorative. Historians still argue whether medieval maternal mortality sat nearer 1% of births or nearer 3, and the working range they use is exactly that wide. 1 to 3, because the sources are parish-shaped and full of holes. Aristocratic English women between about 1236 and 1503 suggest a figure no higher than around 1.2%. 15th century Florence gives roughly 14.4 deaths for every 1,000 births, and every one of those numbers is per birth, which is the trick of them, because she will not do this once. She will do it 6 times, or 8, or 10, and the risk stacks up behind her like water behind a dam, and the number that matters to her is not the one for tonight, but the one for all of them together, and that number is a great deal larger than anything written down. The killers are few and consistent. Obstructed labour, where the child simply will not pass. Malpresentation, where it arrives in the wrong order. Hemorrhage after, and puerperal fever in the days that follow, arriving unseen and unexplained, in an age with no idea that clean hands are a medical instrument. But tonight it goes well. That is the other thing the numbers do, honest to read. They tell you that most of the time, most women, most nights, it goes well. There is noise, and then there is a different kind of noise, and then somebody laughs with relief, and the midwife does what she does, and the room rearranges itself around a very small and extremely annoyed new person, and the girdle is rolled up carefully to go back to the abbey. Then she does not leave the house for about 40 days, not as punishment, as convalescence with a liturgical wrapper on it. Rest, seclusion, no field work, no market, no heavy lifting, visitors managed. The world held at arm's length while the body knits, and at the end of it comes the churching. She dresses. She walks to the parish church with a lighted candle in her hand, with the same women beside her who are in the room, and at the door the priest receives her, and she is blessed, and she is formally returned to the ordinary world. Some churchmen framed it as purification, which she is entitled to resent. Most women appear to have treated it as their day, and to have made a small procession of it, and to have gone somewhere afterwards with the gossips, where the wine was best. And a fortnight later, in the same street, another woman is not well. The birth was 3 weeks ago, and something has not settled. The fever comes and goes. She is grey around the mouth. She cannot feed the child properly, and the pain in her belly is not the pain she was told to expect. The neighbours do not send for a physician, because there is not one within a day's ride, and he would want paying in coin. They send for the woman at the end of the lane, who keeps a garden with some very specific things growing in it, and who arrives with a basket and does not ask any of the questions a man would have started with. She sits down on the edge of the bed first, which the university men never do, and she puts the back of her hand against the woman's cheek and then against her belly. And then she asks how long and how much and what colour, and does not once look embarrassed about any of it. This is medicine, as it was actually. Practiced by most people most of the time, locally by women, learned by watching, paid for in eggs. But do not make the mistake of thinking it was only folklore, because behind her, running back a couple of centuries and 1,000 miles south, there is a written tradition, and it has a real woman at the bottom of it. Her name was Trota, and she worked at Salerno in southern Italy in the early to middle 12th century, in what was then the most serious medical town in Europe, a place where Greek and Arabic and Latin learning had piled up on top of each other, and where a woman practicing medicine and being cited by name was not scandalous but ordinary. She wrote, or was credited with, the Practica Secundum Trotum, the practice according to Trota, and it is a working clinician's book full of cases and specifics. And here is where almost every retelling goes wrong, so let it be said plainly, Trotula is the name of a text, not a woman. There was no Dame Trotula. The Trotula is an ensemble of 3 separate works, compiled at Salerno around 1100, and travelling together afterwards as one bundle, the way anthologies do. Conditions of Women, Treatments for Women, and Women's Cosmetics. The title got mistaken for an author. The author acquired a biography she never had, and Trota herself was gradually written out of her own century by a filing error. If you have seen her called Trotula, you have watched a misprint outlive an entire civilization. The ensemble was enormous. Something like 126 manuscripts survive, copied and recopied across 4 centuries, translated out of Latin into French and English and Dutch and Hebrew, cut up, rearranged and stuffed into other people's compilations. That makes it one of the most widely circulated medical texts of the entire Middle Ages, on a subject the same period claimed to find unmentionable, which tells you what people actually wanted to read as opposed to what they said they wanted to read. And Trota's own genuine work vanished. Not dramatically. It just fell out of view, absorbed into the bundle that had taken her name, until John F. Benton identified a copy of it in a manuscript in Madrid in 1985, which is to say, within living memory. Which is to say that for 800 years the most important female medical author in Europe was sitting in a library under somebody else's file heading. Then there is what does not get written down, or gets written down sideways. Because a great deal of what the woman at the end of the lane knows is about not being pregnant and about being less pregnant, and the church has an extremely firm position on both. So the knowledge goes underground into the vocabulary. Pennyroyal, rue, savin, tansy, wild carrot, myrrh, parsley, a list of plants that every experienced woman in the parish could recite, and that appears in the written herbals under a beautifully bland heading, Menstrua Provocata, agents to restore the blocked menses, not preventing anything, you understand, merely restoring a natural rhythm that has unaccountably paused. It is a euphemism doing 400 years of extremely heavy lifting, and everybody involved, including the men writing the manuscripts, knew exactly what it meant. And it was not all nonsense, which is the uncomfortable part. Pennyroyal and catnip contain polygonie, which is a genuine abortifacient, and also genuinely poisonous, and the distance between those two facts was measured in dead women nobody recorded. This was not empowerment, it was a real pharmacology, held by people with no way to measure a dose, in a world that had made asking about it a sin. Historians still argue whether these preparations were used mainly as contraceptives, mainly as abortifacients, or mainly, and quite sincerely, as treatments for the thing they claimed to treat. And since the entire vocabulary was designed from the outset to make that question unanswerable, it is likely to stay that way. And then, occasionally, a woman like this ends up in court. Paris, the 11th of August, 1322. Jacoba Felicia de Almeida is cited before the court by the medical faculty for practicing medicine without a license. She's not accused of hurting anybody. That is not the charge and never was. 8 witnesses are called, all but one of them are her patients, and they file in and they say, one after another, that she came when they were ill, that she examined them, that she gave them what she gave them and stayed until they were better, and that they got better. One of them says outright that she is a better physician and surgeon than any man in Paris. Several state that the licence masters had already been to see them and had failed. She herself argues reasonably that it is improper for men to palpate the breasts and abdomens of women, and that women will therefore go untreated rather than be examined, and that she exists precisely in that gap. The verdict comes on the 22nd of November 1322, and it is almost admirable in its refusal to pretend. Her plea that she cured many sick persons whom the master could not cure, the court finds, ought not to stand, and is frivolous, since it is certain that a man approved in the aforesaid art could cure better than any woman. Certain, that is the word they use. Not likely, not arguable, certain. She's convicted, fined, and threatened with excommunication, and the 8 people who owe her their health are sent home. Meanwhile, the third text in the Salerno bundle sits there, quietly outselling the other 2, and it is not about disease at all. It is about how to look. Women's cosmetics, or in its Latin, de ornatu mulierum, and it is a shopping list for a war fought on the surface of a face. To whiten the skin, take eggs and steep them in strong vinegar until the shells go soft, which they will, given time, and which is a genuinely strange thing to have sitting on a kitchen shelf for a week. Then combine what you have with white mustard and ginger. For freckles, powdered serpentary root and cuttlefish bone and frankincense, ground fine and made up with water. For golden hair, the ash of burnt vine, barley chaff, licorice wood and sow-bread, boiled together, and the result is aggressive enough that you understand why so many recipes are followed by a recipe for repairing what the first one did. There are depilatories built on quicklime and orpiment, which is arsenic in a party dress, and which worked in the sense that the hair definitely came off. Tooth powders, breath sweeteners, several, suggesting a market, and recipes claiming to restore the appearance of virginity, which tells you rather more about the buyer's circumstances than the seller meant to. And it is the most copied part of the bundle, because of course it is. Which brings the preachers back, because the pulpit has views on paint, and stronger views still on hats. In 1428, a Carmelite friar named Thomas Connect set out across Flanders, Artois, Picardy, and northern France on a mule, and he had one great subject, the hennin, the tall-horned headdress of the noblewomen, the cone or the twin peaks with the veil floating off the back, the silhouette you picture the instant anybody says medieval. Connecty called it a diabolic invention. He preached against it in fields to enormous crowds, and then did the thing that makes him genuinely remarkable, which is that he industrialized it. He granted indulgences, time off purgatory, actual spiritual currency, to any boy who would chase a noblewoman through the street shouting "Oenin" and pull the headdress off her head. He weaponized children, and it worked exactly as well as you would expect, because if you offer a 12-year-old salvation in exchange for licensed rudeness to his social superiors, the response is not going to be tepid. Bonfires were built in front of the preaching platform, the headdresses went into them, women came forward and gave them up, and the flames were reportedly very impressive. The chronicler Monstrelet records the ending with a straight face that is kept for 600 years. The women laid the hennin aside, and then, once the friar had moved on, little by little they took up their former array as grandly as before, or more so. He got them slightly taller, and Thomas Connectee, having spent his career explaining what God found offensive, went to Rome and kept explaining, and was burned there for heresy in 1433, which is less a happy ending than a structural observation about who gets to decide what is diabolic. But friars are amateurs. The professionals were the city governments. Florence had been legislating against luxury since 1281, and never stopped, and neither did anywhere else, and the enforcement officers acquired a nickname that says everything, the Officiali delle Donne. The officials of women. Their job was to assess what women wore against the statute, and they did not do it politely. They waited outside taverns and in the marketplaces and the piazzas and at the doors of the Duomo, where the whole city passed on a Sunday in its best. And they stopped women in the street, and where they found forbidden jewellery they pinched it and tore it from necks and arms on the spot. The statutes are wonderfully, insanely specific because generality is a loophole. The Florentine law of 1356 forbids any woman or girl in the city, at home or outside it, to use on any garment any button that is enamelled or glazed and decorated with pearls or precious stones. That is a law about buttons. Somewhere a committee of grown men debated buttons and voted. England went at it from the other end. The Statute of 1363 pegs what you may wear directly to the rank of your father or your husband. This cloth for a knight's wife, that cloth not. Cloth of gold and sable barred here, velvet there. Your clothes are not yours. They are a public statement of a man's standing, and dressing above it is a species of forgery. Venice passed 42 separate pieces of sumptuary legislation between 1299 and 1419, a new one every 2.5 years for 2 centuries, which is the clearest possible evidence that not one of them worked. And then the boxes. Venice, Florence and Perugia installed secret denunciation boxes, into which any citizen could drop the name of a woman seen wearing something she should not have been. Anonymous, unanswerable, and because the informer was paid a cut of the fine, denunciation stopped being civic virtue and became a small, brisk, extremely reliable trade, conducted mostly by people who knew exactly which of their neighbours owned what. Some cities went further and deliberately hired an outsider as enforcement officer, a man from another town entirely, on the sound theory that he would have no friends to protect and no cousins to overlook. Historians still argue whether all this legislation was really about morality, or about keeping the newly rich from dressing like the old rich, or about protecting local cloth from imports, or simply about the fines, which were substantial and which the cities collected with great enthusiasm. But strip the statutes back, and the thing underneath is not fabric. It is reputation. Buttons matter because buttons say something, and what they say is said about her in her absence by people who are not obliged to be fair. Everything here, the paint and the hennin and the pearls and the pinched clasps, is a fight over a single question. What will they say about her when she is walked past? And in a parish of 400 people, where every debt and every marriage and every night out is public property, what they say is not gossip. It is her credit, her trade, her match, her standing, the whole ledger. Which is why, when somebody says the wrong thing about her at the well on a Tuesday morning, it does not stay at the well. It goes to court, not the manor court and not the sheriff's. The church court, because a good name is a spiritual possession and wrecking one is a sin against charity, which makes it the bishop's business. And by the later 15th century in London, defamation suits are a full third of everything the church courts handle. A third. More than tithes, more than wills, words. At Canterbury by the 1520s they are the single most numerous case type on the books, which means the busiest ecclesiastical court in the region has quietly become an office for deciding what the neighbours are allowed to say. You would assume that is a rich woman's luxury. It is not. The litigants are almost entirely non-elite, craftsmen, small traders, servants, the wives of all three, people whose reputation is not an ornament but working capital. Gentry have other channels. A private letter, a patron, a word in the right ear. If you are the woman who brews on Thursdays and sells at her own door, you have your name. And if somebody breaks it, you go to law, because there is nowhere else to take it, and overwhelmingly it is women who go. One study of 15th century courts at Wisbey in London and at Durham turned up 102 defamation cases, and 77 of them concerned women. That is disproportionate by any measure, and not because women were more easily wounded. A man's credit stood on several legs: his craft, his land, his father, his guild, and a woman's stood largely on one, and everybody in the parish knew exactly where to kick. The insults survive, which is the accidental gift of a bureaucracy that wrote everything down. A court cannot rule on a slander without recording it, so clerks trained in Latin stop mid-sentence, switch into English to get the words exactly right, and hand you a 15th century market square with the sound still on. A scold and a stinkin' whore. Shouted in the open, in front of the stalls, in front of everyone she sells to, and the case reaches court within the week. And from a York case, a phrase I would genuinely have liked to be present for. Tup-asked queen. A tup is a ram. I will leave that there and let you assemble it at your own pace. But notice that week. She has heard the insult, understood precisely what it will do to her trade, found a proctor and filed. That is not a woman losing her temper. That is a woman protecting a business, unless the court decides she is the problem. The cucking stool appears in England from the 13th century, and it is not the thing films have told you it is. It is a chair, often, and this is the detail I cannot get past, literally a close stool, the least dignified object in any house. A woman convicted of being a common scold, a habitual disturber of the peace, is tied into it and paraded through the town so the whole parish can look at her sitting in a lavatory, going nowhere in particular at walking pace. Get the chronology right though, because this is one of the most garbled subjects in popular history. The ducking stool, the one that actually dunks her in the river, is largely Tudor and later, and the scold's bridle, the branks, the iron frame locked over the head with a plate filling the mouth, is not medieval at all in the surviving record. It turns up first in Scotland in 1567, when Bessie Taillefer of Edinburgh was sentenced to be branket and fixed to the market cross for an hour, for slandering a baillie over false measures. Her offence was accusing an official of cheating on weights. Her punishment was a device that made it impossible to say so again. Nobody at the time appears to have found that ironic. Norwich still carries a plaque on Pye Bridge recording a cucking stool in use from 1562 to 1597, and the last recorded uses are so late they feel like a joke the calendar is playing. Jenny Pipes of Leominster in 1809 and Sarah Leake in 1817, by which time the pond was so low that the authorities gave up on the water and simply wheeled her round the town in the chair, which is both a punishment and a parade float, and I am not sure which one the crowd came for. Historians still argue whether the explosion of defamation suits means people were slandering each other more than before, or simply that the church courts had become cheap and quick enough that quarrels, which had always existed, finally acquired a paper trail. But the same mouth that lands her in the court records is having an extremely good time on the other days, and there is a whole song genre to prove it. Across England and France in the 15th and 16th centuries there are songs about gossips. Not gossip the activity, gossips, the people. And they follow a formula so consistent it is practically a screenplay. The women meet entirely by accident, you understand, purely by chance, and agree they may as well. They go 2 by 2 rather than in a crowd, so no husband notices a procession. They do not go to the nearest tavern. They go where the wine is best because they are not amateurs. And then they praise the wine at length, complain about their marriages at greater length, and somebody's cup keeps being refilled. The joke is affectionate more often than cruel, and the picture underneath is of women with money in their own hands and an afternoon they have decided to spend. There is even a ball game. Stool ball, attested from the 15th century in Sussex, played by mixed teams of men and women. A milking stool for the wicket. The bittle from the milk bowl for the bat, which tells you precisely who invented it. Milkmaids. It is bound up with Easter and courtship, so the fielding arrangements were, one imagines, not entirely random. And then you turn at the end of the street, and there is a woman standing quite still in a doorway, dressed in black watching the light go, and she owns the doorway, and the building behind it, and the goods inside. and the ground it all stands on. She's a widow, and in the whole legal architecture of the medieval West, that is the strangest promotion available to a woman, because it arrives by bereavement and hands back everything the marriage took away. Think about the sequence you have been living all night. As a girl, under your father. As a wife, Covette de Baron, your legal personality folded into your husband's like a letter into an envelope, unable, without his express permission, to buy, to contract, to lease, or to bring a suit. And then he dies, and in the space of a single funeral you become a person again. You can make contracts, you can transfer land, you can go to law in your own name, sue, be sued, appear, answer, win. Nothing about you has changed. Not one skill in your hands is different on Thursday from what it was on Wednesday. Only the man is missing, and with him the fiction that you were ever an appendage. And you're not sent away empty. Dower at common law is most commonly a third of all the lands your husband held, yours for your lifetime. And Magna Carta, of all documents, has clauses about it. A widow shall have her marriage portion at once and without trouble. She shall pay nothing for her dower. And in the line that ought to be quoted far more often, no widow shall be compelled to marry so long as she wishes to remain without a husband. Somewhere in 1215 a committee of extremely armoured men decided that among the most urgent grievances in the realm, alongside the fish weirs and the Welsh hostages, was that nobody should force a widow up the aisle, and you can measure what came of it. The London Court of Husting enrolled wills from 1258 to 1578, and the tally is 3,473 men and 435 women. A lopsided number, and the easy reading is that women were invisible. Read it the other way round. 435 women in one city's register held property independently enough, and substantially enough, to make it worth the expense of enrolling a will about it. Everyone is a woman disposing of things that were legally, unambiguously hers. There is a demographic engine underneath this. In the London Mercery, the successful silk women turn up again and again in one pattern. A younger woman married to a considerably older man. John Bally was about 57 when he died. Run that arithmetic across a whole trade for a century, and what you manufacture, systematically, is a cohort of women in their 30s and 40s who have spent 20 years learning a business from the inside, who now own it outright, who have capital, contacts, apprentices and stock, and another 30 working years in front of them. Historians still argue whether widows like these were genuinely the most economically independent women in medieval Europe, or merely the most visible, since a widow's transactions had to be recorded under her own name while a wife's identical work vanished under her husband's. But if you want to see what the ceiling looked like, you go to Winchester. Her name is Licoricia, and it means sweetmeat, which is the sort of name you give a much-loved child, and which sits oddly beside a career spent lending money to kings. She first appears in the records in 1234, already widowed, with 3 sons and a daughter called Balia. In 1242 she marries David of Oxford, the richest Jew in England, and the marriage is contested, sufficiently contested that Henry III intervenes personally to stop the English Beth Din obstructing it, which means the King of England took time out of running a kingdom to referee a marriage settlement inside a community he taxed relentlessly and otherwise barely thought about. David dies in 1244, and here the story turns very hard. Licoricia is taken to the Tower of London and held there, not for a crime, a security, a human bond for the crown's share of her husband's estate. The figure is 5,000 marks, and 4,000 of those marks go to the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey and the shrine of Edward the Confessor, which is still standing. If you have ever walked into Westminster Abbey and looked up at the stone, part of what you were looking at was paid for by a Jewish widow held in a tower until she agreed to it. Nobody carved her name anywhere on the building. She's released in September 1244, and then she goes back to work, and over the next 30 years she finances Henry III himself, Queen Eleanor of Provence, and Simon de Montfort, which is to say she lent to the king and also to the man who eventually rebelled against him, which is either superb diversification or the ordinary condition of anybody whose business is other people's cash flow. The historian Robert Stacey calls her the most important Jewish woman in medieval England, and it is hard to see who would displace her. In early 1277 she is killed in her own house on Jury Street in Winchester, and so is her Christian servant, Alice of Bicton, both stabbed. Belia is the one who finds them. 3 men are indicted, none is convicted. The case has stayed unsolved for 750 years, and the record simply stops, the way records do. The coda is quieter and somehow worse. In 1287, her son Asher is imprisoned in Winchester Castle, and scratches Hebrew into the wall, a few words, a mark, a man recording that he existed in a room he did not choose. And in 1290, every Jew in England is expelled by royal edict, this family among them, and the community that had underwritten cathedrals and crusades and kings is removed. The debts owed to them revert to the crown, which was always the tidiest part of the arrangement. So that is a widow at the very top of the world. Enormous power, and no floor underneath it. Come back to London, then, to a widow of an entirely different kind, whose problem is not survival, but an unpaid invoice. Because somebody in the royal household has ordered a very expensive piece of embroidery, and is being remarkably slow about settling up. Her name is Rose de Burford, and the debtor is the King of England. She's the daughter of Thomas Romaine, a London wool and spice merchant and alderman. So she grew up inside the trade at a table where the talk was freight and customs and the price of wool at Calais. She married her father's business partner, John de Burford. And before you file that under sad arranged things, notice that it put two halves of the same commercial brain into one household. When John dies around 1322, she does not sell up, and she does not hand it to a factor. She takes the whole business and runs it, exporting raw English wool to Calais, the largest and most tightly regulated commodity trade in the kingdom. But the entry worth stopping on is dated the 17th of May, 1317. On that day, Edward II pays Rose de Burford 50 marks for an embroidered cope, a great ceremonial half-circle of a cloak worked in opus Anglicanum, English work, the most admired embroidery on the planet, bought by popes and cardinals because nothing else in Europe comes close. The cope is a gift from Queen Isabella to Pope John the 22nd. 50 marks, which is half of what she was owed. The King of England buying a present for the Pope on the Never Never. Her husband had also lent Edward money for the Scottish War, and that had not been repaid either. She petitions the royal court at least 5 times, politely, formally, repeatedly, into a silence. And she gets nowhere until she stops asking to be paid and proposes instead that the debt be offset against her own wool export customs duty, which is to say she stopped waiting for the crown to pay her and simply arranged to stop paying the crown. An elegant piece of financial engineering, invented by a widow who had run out of patience, which brings you to the silkwomen, who by the rules of the period should not exist. The London silkwomen had a recognised mystery, a trade, a body of skill, a collective identity, and they never formed a guild, not once, not in 2 centuries, no charter, no hall, no livery, no formal standing at all. And they organised anyway. They petitioned Parliament 4 times between 1455 and 1484, complaining about Lombard merchants flooding the market with ribbons and chains, falsely and deceitfully wrought, and they won. The Importation Act of 1455. Women with no legal corporate existence lobbied Parliament and changed the law on imports. Somebody in Westminster must have learned to recognise the handwriting. The names are wonderful. Ellen Langworth, who died in 1481, twice widowed and childless, mistress of 3 named apprentices, Agnes Walshall, Agnes Sampson and Alice Dunaway, who sold silk to the royal household and was styled, in Latin, magistra. And here is the detail to savour. In 1476, the Tailors' Company spent 2 shillings on a pike and a pottle of wine for Mistress Ellen Langworth, and the Cutlers' Company spent 8d on a rabbit and a hen for her. 2 ancient and self-important livery companies, independently deciding that the right move that year was to buy dinner for one artisan widow. Nobody buys a woman a fish in a bottle because she is charming. They did it because they needed her. Alice Claver, who died in 1489, was widowed in 1456, never remarried, and ran the business for over 30 years. She supplied Edward IV, Richard III, and Queen Anne Neville, including the mantle laces for their coronation, so the ribbon holding the Crown Day robes closed on the King and Queen of England came out of her workshop. And then Henry VII, having survived a change of dynasty with her client list intact. She left the business to another silkwoman, Catherine Champion, rather than to any male relative. Isabel Fleet, who died in 1455, left bequests to 5 women skilled in her crafts of dyer, throster and coarse weaver. And Agnes Cotford is glimpsed once in 1441, buying £5 of gold thread from a Venetian for £11, 13 shillings and fourpence, a sum that could have bought a small house spent in an afternoon on thread. Elsewhere the arrangements were more formal. Cologne had 4 craftswomen's guilds: yarn makers, silk makers, silk spinners and gold spinners, 4 more than London ever managed. And in Paris, Etienne Boileau compiled the Livre des Métiers in 1268, a register of roughly 100 crafts, of which 5 were headed by women. Its silk ordinance states flatly that any woman who wishes to weave silk kerchiefs may do so, provided she knows how to practice the craft well and truly. A licensing test based purely on competence. 93 Parisian silk throsters were wealthy enough to be taxed, and the apprenticeship fees run backwards, which delights me every time. 4 livres for an apprenticeship of under 6 years, 40 sous for under 8, and for a 10-year apprenticeship. Nothing at all. The longer you signed up for, the less you paid, because the mistress was buying labour and you were buying training. And both sides knew the exchange rate. Historians still argue whether the London silkwomen never formed a guild because the city would not let them, or because they had worked out that a guild is mostly a tax and a rulebook and they were doing fine without one. Which leaves the loophole everybody has heard of and almost nobody describes accurately. Femme sole is largely our phrase. The London term was uxor quae sola mercandizat, the wife who trades alone. It let a married woman contract and be sued in her own right. It existed in a handful of towns. No town produced a register, so we cannot count them. And it was repeatedly weaponised, because a status that lets a wife be sued alone also lets a creditor come for her when her husband has nothing left. Anne de Velde, in 1486, facing prison over a debt of 18 shillings, said she never was sole merchant nor knew what the term meant until this time that necessity teaches her. Necessity teaches her. That is, a woman discovering her own legal status at the moment it is used to lock her up, and she at least got into a courtroom. Turn now to the ones who never did. They did not go to court at all, they were fetched. Open the criminal records and what hits you is how few of them there are. Jail delivery records between 1388 and 1409 give 8,879 indictments across all 6 English circuits, and the ratio runs at roughly 1 female suspect for every 25 male. Whatever medieval women were, they were not statistically a threat to public order. Break down the 211 women indicted between 1388 and 1399, and it reads like an inventory. 140 thefts, 33 homicides, 25 as accessories, 5 for helping a prisoner escape, 4 arsons, 3 woundings, and 1, exactly 1, for treason. But here is the number that stops people. Homicide made up 16% of all indictments in that period, men included, and 16% of women's indictments. The same figure. Women committed vastly less crime overall, but the shape of it matched the men's almost exactly. What they stole is more interesting than that they stole. Money mostly, and just as often wool, raw and woven, exactly what you would expect from women who handled wool every day, knew what a bundle was worth and would take it. Clothing, grain, all of which supports the tidy explanation: desperate, hungry, feeding somebody, except that furred tunics keep turning up, and kerchiefs, and silver bracelets, far too often for hunger to cover it. Some of these women were not stealing dinner, they were stealing nice things. And a history in which women may only sin from starvation is not kinder, just duller. The London coroner's rolls between 1300 and 1340 cover 9 surviving years. 142 homicides inside the city walls, 238 named suspects, 92% male and 8% female. 31% of the deaths happened on a Sunday, 77% between early evening and just after curfew, 68% in the streets, squares, markets and wharfs. Which is to say the city is at its most dangerous when it is at its most sociable. The day off, after dark, in public, among people who have been drinking. 4 of those cases have a woman as the sole suspect. One is Isabella Heron, who killed her lover, a fishmonger named William Misson, with a knife. That is nearly all that survives of either of them. 2 names, a trade, a relationship, an ending. Occasionally the accusation points upward. In 1332, Archbishop Simon Mepham names a noblewoman. Ella Fitzpaine in a letter, and the coroner's roll fills in the rest. After a quarrel, she persuades 4 men, her brother, 2 servants, and a chaplain, to kill a priest called John Ford. It is the chaplain that gets me. Somebody talked that man into it and he said yes. Then, the margin the authorities licensed on purpose. In 1161, Henry II issues 39 rules under a title only a medieval clerk could love, the ordinances touching the government of the stewholders in Suffolk. Bankside, across the river, outside the city's jurisdiction, and the lord of that manor is the Bishop of Winchester, which is how the licensed women there became known as Winchester geese. Around 18 licensed houses. The rules require registration, restrict work on religious holidays, bar nuns and married women, and guarantee the women freedom to come and go as they please. A startling clause for a 12th century document, and they take a firm position on whether a single woman may also sell pies. Somewhere there was a meeting about the pies. Somebody lost that argument. When they died, they were buried at Crossbones, unconsecrated ground outside the churchyard, because the bishop would take the rent, but not the burial. And then, in the summer of 1381, it all comes apart. The King's Bench records describe a woman from Rochester named Johanna Ferrer as the chief perpetrator and leader of rebellious evildoers from Kent. Not a follower, not present, leader, she's at the Savoy, John of Gaunt's palace, the richest private house in England, when it burns. She seizes a chest containing £1,000 and more belonging to the Duke of Lancaster, puts it in a boat on the Thames, takes it to Southwark, and divides the gold. She's charged with ordering the executions of Archbishop Simon Sudbury and Treasurer Robert Hales, and with the storming of the Tower, and there is no record that she was ever convicted. Historians still argue whether the paperwork is lost, or whether a court willing to write her down as the ringleader could not bring itself to finish the sentence. At Cambridge on the 16th of June that year, Marjorie Starr stands in the market throwing the ashes of burnt university documents to the wind, shouting, "Away with the learning of clerks." In Suffolk, Catherine Gayman is accused of pushing a boat out across the River Little Ouse to cut off the Chief Justice's escape. One woman, one boat, closing a river against the highest judge in England. And at the top, briefly, because they get enough attention already. Eleanor of Aquitaine takes the cross at Vézelay in 1147, has her marriage annulled on the 21st of March 1152, marries Henry of Anjou 8 weeks later, spends 16 years imprisoned for backing her son's revolt, and at about 77 crosses the Pyrenees in winter, ambushed on the road, which inconvenienced her rather than stopped her. Blanche of Castile is widowed in November 1226 and has her son Louis crowned at Reims inside a month. Margaret of Anjou, shipwrecked after Towton, is stopped in the northern forest by an armed robber, pushes her son forward and says, "Behold the son of Henry your king, and save him." And the robber escorts them to safety, the most surprising outcome in this entire script. And Joan of Arc, about 19 and unable to read, at Rouen in 1431, facing dozens of theologians without a lawyer, whose one fatal charge was her clothing. Her answer: "It is both more seemly and proper to dress like this when surrounded by men than wearing a woman's clothes." That is the loud end of the century. Now set it down, the banners, the boats, the burning palace, and follow a corridor to a very small room, where somebody's being walled in on purpose. She goes in through a door that will be sealed behind her. Sometimes there is a funeral rite said out loud while she's alive and kneeling. The prayers for the dead, for a woman who has not died. Because in the terms the church is using, she has. What remains is enclosed in a cell against the wall of a church, and it does not come out. The Enchaîné Vis, the guide for anchoresses, written in the early 13th century for 3 sisters who had chosen this, prescribes exactly 3 windows. One opens into the church so she can see the altar and the Eucharist. One is for food and goods, and one, the parlour window, faces the world, and that is the one that causes the trouble because people come to it constantly, wanting advice and prayers and to tell her things, and the guide is very firm about limiting it. And then the line everybody remembers: "You shall keep no animal except one cat." Not out of cruelty. An anchoress should not have anything which draws away her heart. No cow, no chickens, no property, nothing that needs her. But a cat is permitted, presumably because a stone cell with grain in it has mice, and even the most rigorous spiritual program in Europe has to come to terms with mice. The same book tells the mistress not to nag her maidservants, a wonderfully human note in a manual about being bricked into a wall. This sounds like a small life. It is not. It is one of the only rooms in medieval Europe where a woman is left alone with her mind for decades. On the 8th of May, 1373, a 30-year-old woman in Norwich is believed to be dying. Over the hours that follow, she receives 16 showings, showings, visions, and then, inconveniently for everyone, she recovers. She's enclosed at St. Julian's Church, keeps 2 maidservants named Sarah and Alice, and spends 20 years working out what she saw. She writes it down, then writes it again, vastly longer. The long text of Julian of Norwich is the first book known to have been written in English by a woman, and the line everyone carries out of it: "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." 2 centuries earlier, several hundred miles east, Hildegard of Bingen, a 10th child handed to the church as a girl, writes Civius, and Pope Eugenius III reads portions aloud and approves. She coins a word, viriditas, greenness, the living, insistent force she saw running through creation. In 2012 she was made a Doctor of the Church, 833 years after she died, a long time to wait for a promotion. Not everyone survives the window. Marguerite Porret writes, "The mirror of simple souls" in Old French rather than Latin, which is much of the offence. French means anybody can read it. Before her inquisitors she refuses to speak, for 18 months. She's burned at the Place de Grève in Paris on the 1st of June 1310. But the book does not burn. It circulates anonymously for 600 years, read as respectable devotional literature by people with no idea whose book they held, until 1946, when a scholar matched the text to her name. Christine de Pizan is widowed at 25 in 1390, with 3 children, a mother and a niece to support. She writes her way out. Around 40 works, Europe's first professional woman of letters, and in 1405, the Book of the City of Ladies. Her last work is dated the 31st of July, 1429, about a teenage girl at Orléans, the only work about Joan of Arc written while Joan was alive. Margery Kemp, illiterate, dictates the first autobiography in English, and around 1413 travels to Norwich to sit at Julian's window and talk. 2 women, 1 wall, 1 book each, and last, the one with no name at all. In January 2019, researchers analysed the dental calculus, hardened plaque, of a middle-aged woman buried at a small women's monastic community at Dalheim, in Germany, radiocarbon dated to between 997 and 1162. Embedded in it were over 100 particles of lazurite, lapis lazuli, the source of ultramarine, then costlier than gold, mined in one valley in Badakhshan, in Afghanistan, 6,000 kilometres away. Historians still argue whether she was the painter herself or only prepared the pigment for someone else, but the likeliest explanation, and the one the researchers favour, is the simplest. She pointed her brush with her lips, over and over, for years the way painters do. No name, no signature, no mention in any chronicle. Just a woman in a small German house of religious women, trusted with the costliest substance in Europe, tidying the tip of her brush against her mouth, and 900 years later blue in her teeth. And that is where we will leave it. Let the room go quiet now. Let the 3 windows go dark, one after another, the church, the food, the world. The cat is asleep somewhere near the wall, let the market pack up. The stalls come down, the ale signs come off their hooks, the street empties, the last cart goes over the bridge. Let the chamber warm and empty. Let the candle be carried gently back down the aisle and put out. Let the fire in the cottage sink to that low red glow under the ash. The one you woke to, hours and hours ago now. The distaff is set down against the wall, the spindle has stopped turning, your hands are still. Nothing left to card tonight, nothing to fetch, nothing to carry. The bucket is full by the door and the door is shut and the latch is down. Somewhere a woman is counting coins into a purse that is hers. Somewhere a name is being written into a will. Somewhere a girl is learning to spin badly and laughing at herself. They were all real. Every single one of them. That is the whole thing, really. You do not have to remember any of it. Not a single date. It will keep. Just let it settle now. Let it go soft at the edges. Let the names blur and drift and go. Warm blankets. Quiet room. Nothing to do. Breathe out. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Sleep now. Sweet dreams.